Welcome back to Background Historian. Tonight, we begin a gentle and deeply calming exploration of one of the most significant events of the early 21st century, the Iraq War. This series is crafted for rest and reflection, not tension. Over 20 slow-moving chapters, we will walk through the origins, timeline, decisions, motivations, and consequences of the conflict, all presented in a steady, soothing tone that helps you drift towards sleep. Rather than focusing on graphic details or disturbing moments, we will examine the broader movements of history, the diplomatic currents, the political choices, the shifting international landscape, and the long arc of events that shaped the region. You will encounter the story as though carried along by a quiet stream. The final years of the 1990s, the build-up to the invasion, the early months of the conflict, the long occupation, the rise of new factions, global reactions, and the slow, complicated unwinding of a war that touched millions of lives. It is a history told with gentleness, designed to help you understand the world while still relaxing deeply. Part 1. The Long Shadows Before the War. When we speak about the Iraq War, it is easy to begin in March of 2003, as American missiles arched through the early morning darkness over Baghdad. Yet the true beginning lies much earlier. History rarely acts suddenly. Instead, it accumulates, gathering small pressures and unresolved tensions until nations find themselves at a point that feels inevitable. To understand the Iraq War in a peaceful, reflective way, we begin in the soft dusk of the 1990s, when the world order was shifting, and Iraq was standing in the center of it more than anyone realized. Tonight, we allow the events to unfold slowly. You can imagine each year as a quiet footstep on a long path, each policy as a page turned gently in a book that took more than a decade to write. The conflict that would become the Iraq War did not rise out of nowhere. It emerged from the lingering aftermath of the Gulf War of 1991, the United Nations sanctions that followed, and the anxieties of the post-Cold War world, where old alliances and new uncertainties shaped international thinking. So let us settle into a measured pace. The history begins not with bombs or headlines, but with a world adjusting to new realities and an Iraq dealing with the aftershocks of a previous confrontation. After Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, the international response was rapid, coordinated, and forceful. A US-led coalition expelled Iraqi forces from Kuwait in early 1991. Iraq's military was weakened, its infrastructure was shattered, and its political future became uncertain. The ceasefire agreement that followed placed harsh restrictions on the country. It demanded that Iraq abandon weapons of mass destruction programs, submit to international inspections, and refrain from threatening its neighbors. These terms, strict as they were, formed the backbone of future disagreements. In the years that followed, Iraq entered a long period of economic hardship under broad United Nations sanctions. These sanctions were meant to pressure Saddam Hussein's government to comply fully with weapons inspections. Yet they also impacted civilians, creating shortages in medicine, food, and essential goods. Much of the world criticized the sanctions regime for its humanitarian consequences, even as the United Nations insisted that Iraq's leadership was to blame for failing to cooperate. This duality, where both sides felt justified and yet each side's actions perpetuated the stalemate, became one of the defining tensions of the decade. Throughout the mid-1990s, United Nations inspectors continued their mission to dismantle Iraq's weapons programs. They destroyed missiles, chemical munitions, and production facilities. Their reports fluctuated between progress and frustration. Sometimes they noted cooperation, other times they described concealment, confusion, or restricted access. To outside observers, the picture grew increasingly murky. Nations within the UN Security Council began to disagree on whether Iraq was truly complying or simply outmaneuvering inspectors. The United States and United Kingdom tended to believe the latter, while France, Russia, and China often argued that the inspections were working and that sanctions should be eased. All the while, Saddam Hussein maintained a defiant stance. His government insisted that Iraq had no remaining prohibited weapons. But the inspectors' uncertainty, combined with Iraq's past behavior, created an atmosphere of mistrust that never fully dissipated. This mistrust would later become a central justification for war. As the 1990s progressed, the world changed rapidly. The Cold War had ended, and the United States emerged as the dominant global power. Its foreign policy increasingly centered on maintaining stability and deterring threats across regions. In Washington, the memory of the Gulf War lingered, especially the decision not to remove Saddam Hussein from power in 1991. Many U.S. officials believed that leaving his regime intact was a mistake. He remained unpredictable and hostile, and his government continued to clash with international monitors. Meanwhile, inside Iraq, the internal political landscape was tense. Failed uprisings in 1991 had left scars and deep divisions. The government remained authoritarian, and dissent was tightly controlled. Regions like Kurdistan in the north functioned with de facto autonomy under the protection of US and British air patrols. These patrols, known as no-fly zones, became constant points of friction, with Iraq frequently firing at the aircraft and the coalition responding with targeted strikes. These exchanges were small, brief, and rarely made front-page news, but they reflected a state of near-continuous hostility long before the war officially began. By the late 1990s, these tensions were reaching a quiet boiling point. Weapons inspections broke down in 1998 after repeated disagreements. Inspectors withdrew, and the United States and United Kingdom launched Operation Desert Fox, a 4-day bombing campaign intended to degrade Iraq's military capability. After this operation, Iraq refused to allow inspectors to return for several years. The absence of inspection oversight only deepened global uncertainty about what Iraq might be hiding. When we look back on this period through the calming lens of history, we see not one single path but a network of intersecting concerns. Each government involved navigated its own priorities. The U.S. was increasingly adopting a foreign policy built on preventing future threats rather than responding to immediate ones. Iraq was trying to resist pressure and preserve sovereignty in the face of overwhelming international power. The United Nations struggled to maintain unity among its member states, all of whom had different interpretations of the same information. And on the ground, ordinary Iraqi families lived through power shortages, rationed food, damaged infrastructure, and the quiet uncertainty of not knowing what might come next. In their homes, the politics of the world felt distant, yet their lives were deeply shaped by the decisions of distant capitals. This is how long-term conflicts grow, not in sudden explosions, but through unresolved disputes, misunderstood intentions, and layers of tension that build slowly over time. By the year 2000, the stage was quietly set. Iraq still faced sanctions. Inspections had stalled. Relations between Iraq and the United States were hostile without being openly warlike. Yet beneath the surface, all of the conditions that would eventually lead to the Iraq War were already present. In this peaceful telling, we let the prelude unfold at its natural rhythm. The decade before the war was defined not by loud events but by simmering uncertainty. It was a time when countries argued over intelligence reports, when leaders made speeches predicting danger, when Iraq struggled under the weight of sanctions, and when the world grappled with the idea of emerging threats in a new century. As the new millennium approached, the horizon darkened not because war was inevitable, but because misunderstandings, fears, and political momentum were aligning. In our next chapter, we will move gently into the transition from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration in the United States, and explore how shifting priorities and worldviews brought the long-standing tensions with Iraq back to the forefront. Part 2. A new administration and a changing world. As the year 2000 gave way to 2001, the world was turning quietly beneath the weight of history, unaware of how drastically its course was about to change. In the United States, a presidential election had just concluded. The transition from President Bill Clinton to President George W. Bush was underway, and with it came a subtle but important shift in foreign policy priorities. This moment, often overshadowed by later events, is essential to understanding the road to the Iraq War. It was a time of reorientation, reflection, and reassessment, with advisors and analysts discussing what threats the new century might bring. In this restful retelling, imagine these discussions not as frantic debates but as quiet meetings in softly lit conference rooms, where the mood was contemplative rather than hurried. Officials sifted through intelligence reports, reviewed old policies, and considered how the world had evolved since the end of the Cold War. The tone was measured, the atmosphere thoughtful, and yet, beneath the surface, concerns were shifting. One of the key figures in this story was Saddam Hussein, the long-standing ruler of Iraq. His name appeared in nearly every foreign policy briefing. Although the immediate tensions of the 1990s had died down, the unresolved nature of Iraq's compliance with United Nations resolutions continued to trouble American officials. For some, Iraq represented unfinished business. They remembered the Gulf War, the ceasefire terms, and the years of difficult inspections that followed. For others, Iraq symbolized a deeper problem. How should the United States handle regimes that resisted international oversight? When George W. Bush entered office in January 2001, members of his foreign policy team already held strong views regarding Iraq. Several advisors had believed since the late 1990s that Saddam Hussein posed a long-term threat. They worried not only about potential weapons programs, but also about regional instability, human rights violations, and Iraq's unpredictable behavior. In their view, the status quo could not last forever. Still, despite these concerns, Iraq was not the administration's primary focus in early 2001. Domestic issues, relations with Russia and China, and missile defense strategies dominated the agenda. Iraq, though significant, remained just one item among many. The tone at this stage was cautious rather than urgent. Intelligence assessments from this period varied widely. Some analysts believed Iraq had reconstituted certain capabilities, while others argued the country was too weakened to pose a serious threat. Nothing was definitive. Nothing demanded immediate action. Then the world changed. On September 11, 2001, the United States experienced a moment of profound trauma. The quiet of an ordinary morning gave way to a shock that would reshape foreign policy across the globe. For coordinated attacks targeted New York City, Washington, D.C., and a fourth plane crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers intervened. Nearly 3,000 civilians lost their lives. The United States entered a new era defined by fear, vigilance, and the desire to prevent any future attacks at all costs. In a sleep-friendly narrative, we approach this moment not with intensity, but with sober reflection. The emotional impact of that day cannot be understated. It altered how individuals thought about safety, how governments evaluated threats, and how intelligence agencies interpreted risks. In the calm of this retelling, we recognize September 11th as a pivot point. Before it, Iraq was a distant concern. After it, Iraq moved steadily toward the center of strategic thinking. The Bush administration responded first with focus on Afghanistan, where the Taliban government had sheltered al-Qaeda, the group responsible for the attacks. But even in those early weeks, discussions quietly widened. The National Security Team began to examine all potential sources of future danger. The central question was no longer simply who had attacked the United States, but who might do so in the future. In this climate of heightened caution, Iraq's name resurfaced repeatedly. Officials examined whether Iraq had connections to terrorism, whether it possessed weapons of mass destruction, and whether Saddam Hussein could become a future threat. Evidence remained inconclusive, fragmented, and often disputed, but the fear of uncertainty pressed heavily on policymakers. It was no longer enough to respond to known dangers. The goal became preventing unseen threats before they emerged. This shift in mindset was subtle yet transformational. And as we recount it in soothing tones, we can observe how slowly and gradually it unfolded. Intelligence analysts submitted reports. Advisors debated possibilities. The president met with his national security team. Each interaction added another brushstroke to the overall picture, which grew darker and more uncertain as the months passed. By late 2001, several key advisors viewed Iraq as unfinished business from the Gulf War, still possessing the potential for destabilization. Others argued that Iraq had been contained for years and could continue to be contained without conflict. The administration did not yet have a unified position. What it did have was a growing sense that the world had entered a more dangerous age, one where inaction might be more perilous than action. Inside Iraq, the situation was equally complex. Saddam Hussein's government remained defiant, insisting it possessed no weapons of mass destruction, yet continuing to resist full cooperation with the United Nations. Many outside observers questioned Iraq's motives. If the country truly had nothing to hide, why not allow inspectors complete access? But Saddam Hussein's regime had long feared appearing weak, both to foreign enemies and domestic rivals. This fear often led the government to act in ways that deepened global suspicion. The result was a cycle of mistrust. Iraq resisted inspections for political reasons. The international community interpreted this resistance as evidence of hidden weapons. That suspicion led to more pressure, which led to further resistance. Round and round it went, like a wheel turning quietly in the night. Meanwhile, the United Nations sanctions continued to strain Iraq's economy. The All-for-Food program, established in 1995 to ease humanitarian suffering, helped somewhat, but the country's infrastructure remained fragile. Many civilians lived in poverty, and the state's grip tightened as the population grew more dependent on government distribution systems. These realities shaped how the world viewed Iraq. Some nations saw a weakened country desperately in need of relief, while others saw a regime that used hardship as leverage and avoided compliance intentionally. As 2002 approached, the United States shifted its attention more intently toward Iraq. But the process was gradual, like the slow tightening of a thread. Speeches emphasized the dangers of uncertain threats. National security strategies adopted a more proactive stance. Congress began discussions about the long-term implications of unresolved conflicts in the Middle East. Slowly but steadily, Iraq moved from being one concern among many to being a primary issue in foreign policy planning. Notably, debates over intelligence assessments intensified. Different agencies interpreted the same information in different ways. Ambiguity became a source of worry. It was in these uncertain spaces, where information was incomplete and interpretations varied, that momentum toward confrontation quietly gathered. As Part 2 closes, we reach the end of a transitional era. The pre-war narrative has now shifted from post-Gulf War stagnation into the aftermath of September 11th, where every potential threat was scrutinized with new urgency. The tone of discussion had changed, global politics were reshaping themselves, and the stage was being set for more consequential decisions. Part 3. The world divides, diplomacy, inspections, and escalating pressure. The year 2002 unfolded with a feeling of tension that built not suddenly, but gradually, like the slow tightening of a rope drawn between two distant points. On one end stood the United States, increasingly convinced that Iraq posed a brewing danger. On the other stood the international community, divided between those who agreed, those who doubted, and those who urged caution. And in between was Iraq itself. A nation under pressure, its government defensive and distrustful, and its people caught in a long shadow of decisions made far above them. In this sleep-friendly retelling, imagine the world in early 2002 as a large, dimly lit room with diplomats seated quietly at long tables, reading reports, exchanging notes, and contemplating the future. There is no shouting here, no frantic debates, only careful words spoken softly and the steady rustle of documents being reviewed. This atmosphere of quiet deliberation helps us see the conflict not as a sudden eruption, but as a series of careful steps taken over many months. As the new year began, President George W. Bush and his administration made Iraq one of their central concerns. Speeches grew more direct. Discussions inside the White House reflected heightened worry about the possibility, however uncertain, that Iraq retained weapons of mass destruction. Some advisors argued that Iraq was actively trying to reconstitute its weapons programs. Others believed the available evidence was ambiguous at best, shaped as much by fear as by fact. But the tone of the administration increasingly leaned toward action. On January 29, 2002, President Bush delivered his State of the Union address. In it, he described an axis of evil consisting of Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Three nations the administration believed were pursuing dangerous weapons and supporting terrorism. The phrase resonated around the world, setting the tone for the months to come. Iraq was no longer simply a long-standing foreign policy concern, it was now framed as a potential threat to global security. Yet the international community was not united in this perspective. Many nations, particularly in Europe, had watched Iraq closely throughout the 1990s and believed the country was largely contained. The sanctions had been harsh, and many argued that they had effectively degraded Iraq's ability to build advanced weapons. These governments advocated for a continued focus on inspections and diplomacy. Some doubted the reliability of the intelligence being presented. Others feared destabilization of the Middle East, a region that had already endured conflict and upheaval for decades. This global divide began to pull at discussions within the United Nations. The UN Security Council, comprised of the world's major powers, met repeatedly to discuss Iraq's status. Some members argued for firmer measures, others for patience. France, Russia, and China were particularly skeptical of military action. They felt inspection should be strengthened rather than abandoned. The United States and the United Kingdom, meanwhile, expressed increasing frustration at Iraq's past behavior and incomplete transparency. Amid this environment of uncertainty, Iraq faced its own internal challenges. Saddam Hussein's government, accustomed to projecting strength and defiance, struggled to respond to renewed international scrutiny. On one hand, Iraq wanted the sanctions lifted, which required cooperation. On the other, the government feared that too much openness could reveal weaknesses that might invite foreign intervention or domestic rebellion. This tension produced a pattern of inconsistent cooperation, sometimes allowing inspections, sometimes restricting them, that fueled global skepticism. To help break the stalemate, the United States pushed for a new United Nations resolution. One that would require Iraq to fully comply with weapons inspections and provide a complete accounting of any prohibited programs. After extensive negotiation, the effort succeeded. In November 2002, the United Nations Security Council unanimously passed Resolution 1441. It offered Iraq a final opportunity to comply with its disarmament obligations. The resolution demanded immediate, unrestricted access for UN inspectors, and it warned of serious consequences if Iraq failed to cooperate fully. This moment is often seen as a turning point. In this calming retelling, imagine the diplomats who cast their votes not as dramatic figures, but as tired individuals aware of the weight of their decisions. They hoped the resolution would avert war. They hoped Iraq would fully comply. They hoped diplomacy would succeed. With the resolution in place, the UN Monitoring, Verification and Inspection Commission, UNMOVIC, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, prepared to return to Iraq for the first time since the late 1990s. Their inspectors included scientists, engineers, and specialists who approached the task with careful professionalism. They carried tools to test soil, examine equipment, and survey facilities. Their mission was immense: to determine whether Iraq had resumed prohibited weapons programs, hidden materials, or obstructed inspections. In late November 2002, inspectors arrived in Baghdad. Cameras captured their quiet, orderly movements as they stepped off planes and traveled across the city in white UN vehicles. They visited weapons factories, military bases, research centers, and storage sites. They conducted interviews. They took samples. They catalogued equipment. They asked questions and reviewed documentation. The early findings were mixed. Inspectors did not discover active nuclear programs. They found no evidence of reconstituted chemical weapons production. But some questions remained unresolved. Certain materials were unaccounted for. Some facilities appeared altered or abandoned. There were discrepancies in Iraq's paperwork. These ambiguities, though not proof of wrongdoing, created room for suspicion to grow. Meanwhile, the Bush administration voiced increasing impatience. Officials argued that Iraq was engaging in deception and delay, pointing to inconsistencies in its reports and past violations. Critics countered that inspections were working and simply needed more time. The divide inside the international community widened. Each new inspection report was interpreted differently depending on the observer's expectations. Countries like France and Germany argued that diplomacy should continue. They believed the inspectors were making progress and that peaceful pressure could achieve compliance. Russia and China voiced similar sentiments. But the United States and the United Kingdom insisted that Iraq was failing to meet its obligations. To them, the lack of full transparency was itself a violation. The public debate grew louder throughout these months, though in this peaceful narrative, we imagine the individuals involved seated at their desks late into the evening, reading reports by lamplight and drafting memoranda slowly, thoughtfully. Even as the world appeared divided, the people behind the decisions often felt the weight of uncertainty and the burden of responsibility. Inside Iraq, the government attempted to present itself as cooperative. Officials allowed inspectors into many sites, permitted aerial surveillance, and submitted a lengthy document outlining their weapons history. Yet they still resisted some interviews and continued to mistrust the process. Their mixed approach only made their intentions harder to discern. By early 2003, the world was deeply split. The United States and the United Kingdom believed Iraq was hiding prohibited weapons and that military force might be necessary. France, Germany, Russia, and others believed the inspections were working and should continue. The UN Security Council remained deadlocked, unable to agree on how to proceed. As February passed into March, the diplomatic clock continued ticking. Inspectors submitted more reports, some cautiously optimistic, some highlighting unresolved questions. Demonstrations occurred worldwide, as millions marched in support of or against the possibility of war. The world watched anxiously, unsure what would unfold next. And yet, despite the tension, everything still moved slowly. The decision had not yet been made. Iraq continued its partial cooperation. The inspectors continued their work. And the world continued debating, weighing risks, and trying to guess what the next chapter would bring. Part 3 ends at this delicate crossroads, the moment just before the final decisions were made. Part 4. The final days before the war. As winter of 2002 slowly shifted into the early months of 2003, the world found itself suspended in an uneasy stillness. Diplomatic meetings, intelligence briefings, UN presentations, and cautious press conferences unfolded day after day, yet no decisive outcome emerged. It was as though the international system stood on a narrow ridge, one side marked by war, the other by the hope that diplomacy might still prevail. Every step, every speech, every inspection report seemed capable of tipping the balance. In this sleep-friendly retelling, imagine these last weeks as a deep blue twilight. The air is still and heavy. Decisions are being prepared in quiet rooms with soft lighting, where papers are stacked neatly and the hum of distant conversation fills the space. The pace is slow, not panicked. The world is contemplative rather than frantic, even as enormous consequences hang silently overhead. The inspector's final push. By early 2003, the UN inspection teams, UNMOVIC and the IAEA, had been back in Iraq for several months. Their work was steady, methodical, almost meditative in its rhythm. They visited laboratories, bunkers, storage facilities, and interviews. They walked through former weapons sites with clipboards in hand, taking notes in the cold winter air. They sifted through documentation, examined equipment, and tested soil samples. Their reports in January and February 2003 carried an almost cautious optimism. They indicated that Iraq was cooperating, at least in procedural ways. Inspectors had been granted access to most requested locations. Surveillance flights had resumed. Several banned missiles were identified, catalogued, and prepared for destruction. The tone of these reports was measured. They found no evidence of active nuclear programs and no clear confirmation of chemical weapon stockpiles. But there were still gaps. Unresolved questions. Inventory records that did not match earlier documentation from the 1990s. Missing munitions that could not be fully accounted for. Facilities that had been dismantled without clear explanations. These ambiguities were enough to sustain the concerns of those who believed Iraq was still hiding dangerous weapons. And so, even as inspectors worked diligently, their findings were interpreted differently depending on the observer. Those who hoped diplomacy would continue read the reports as signs of progress. Those who believed Iraq was playing a long game of concealment saw the same reporting as evidence of obstruction. Two interpretations, one set of facts. Colin Powell's UN speech. On February 5, 2003, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell delivered a presentation to the United Nations Security Council. It was intended to be a decisive moment. A clear, compelling argument that Iraq was in violation of its obligations and remained a threat to international peace. Powell's speech was delivered with calm seriousness. He presented intercepted communications, satellite images, and intelligence assessments. In this gentle recounting, picture a large chamber filled with stillness as delegates listened attentively, their expressions thoughtful. Powell walked through slides and audio recordings, speaking in a steady, controlled voice. He emphasized Iraq's past behavior, its recurring resistance to inspections, and its long record of developing chemical and biological weapons. Some diplomats found the presentation convincing, feeling the evidence fit a pattern of Iraqi behavior. Others remained skeptical, concerned that the information was not definitive. The speech did not resolve the debate, it widened it. Afterward, delegations met privately in soft-lit rooms, whispering their interpretations and discussing whether the evidence justified war. The world remained divided. The United Nations debates intensify. Throughout February and early March 2003, the UN Security Council held numerous meetings. The discussions were formal but tense, filled with carefully chosen words and diplomatic phrasing. France, Germany, Russia, and several other nations continued to argue that inspections were working and should continue. They urged patience, caution, and additional time. France proposed extending inspections for several months. Russia agreed. Germany insisted that peaceful pressure was producing results. Even countries not on the Security Council expressed concern. Across the world, public sentiment leaned strongly toward avoiding war unless absolutely necessary. But the United States and the United Kingdom believed time was running out. To them, Iraq was not providing proactive cooperation, it was merely doing the bare minimum. They argued that Saddam Hussein's government had shown a consistent pattern of hiding prohibited materials in the past, and that ambiguity posed an unacceptable risk in the post-September the 11th world. In speeches that echoed through diplomatic corridors, US and UK, officials spoke of the dangers of waiting, the urgency of confronting potential threats, and the belief that Iraq's disarmament could not be guaranteed without decisive action. As the weeks passed, their tone grew firmer. The search for a second resolution. The United States and the United Kingdom sought a new UN resolution, one that would explicitly authorize the use of force if Iraq did not fully comply. For weeks, diplomats worked tirelessly to gather support. They met in quiet offices, exchanged drafts, and negotiated the precise wording of the text. But the Security Council remained deeply divided. France made clear it would veto any resolution that authorized immediate force. Russia signaled it would likely do the same. Germany expressed unwavering opposition. China hesitated, leaning toward caution. With three major powers resistant, it became increasingly clear the resolution would not pass. By early March, the United States and the United Kingdom recognized that the Security Council would not authorize military action. Diplomatically, they were at a crossroads. They could abandon their plans or proceed without UN approval. Quietly, steadily, they chose the latter. Iraq's last-minute concessions. Sensing the rising risk of conflict, Iraq attempted to demonstrate greater cooperation. It submitted additional documents on past weapons programs. It allowed more interviews. It destroyed several banned al-Samad II missiles under Union supervision. Inspectors reported improved access and increased compliance. Yet these efforts, even if genuine, arrived too late to change the momentum. The United States and its allies remained convinced that Iraq's cooperation was superficial. They believed the regime was making concessions only under the threat of force, not because it had fully disarmed. Diplomats tried desperately to negotiate a compromise. A timeline, a set of benchmarks, a framework for continued inspections. But by mid-March 2003, those efforts quietly dissolved. The evacuation of inspectors. On March 17, 2003, the United Nations ordered all weapons inspectors and humanitarian workers to withdraw from Iraq. The atmosphere at UN headquarters was somber. Inspectors packed their equipment, archived their files, and prepared to leave. Many felt their work had been incomplete. Some believed they were close to resolving key questions. Others were grateful for the chance to leave a potentially dangerous situation. The departure of inspectors was not dramatic, it was quiet, orderly, and filled with unspoken uncertainty. The final ultimatum. On the same day, President George W. Bush delivered an ultimatum. Saddam Hussein and his sons were given 48 hours to leave Iraq, or military action would begin. Iraq rejected the ultimatum immediately. Diplomats across the world watched the clock wind down with a sense of inevitability. The last threads of diplomacy slipped away. The world held its breath. And the war that had been slowly gathering for more than a decade was about to begin. Part 5. The opening airstrikes, shock and awe. The early hours of March 20, 2003 arrived quietly in much of the world, but in the skies over Iraq, the stillness was about to break. What followed would become one of the most recognizable and widely discussed military operations of the 21st century, the United States-led coalition's opening campaign, often called shock and awe. In military terms, it was designed to overwhelm, to disable, to paralyze the Iraqi regime's ability to fight. But in the sleep-friendly retelling here, these events unfold in softened tones, as though one were watching from a distant hill at twilight, the sound muted, the motion slow and gently blurred by the dimness of memory. The night before the strikes. Although the war officially began on March 20th, the atmosphere during the preceding night felt suspended and heavy. Diplomatic channels had closed. The inspectors had left. The final speeches had been made. The public around the world sensed what was coming, even as protests, prayers, and vigils continued in thousands of cities. In Kuwait, US and coalition troops waited in desert camps illuminated by soft yellow floodlights. Many of them had prepared for months. They rested on cots, wrote final letters, checked their gear, or sat quietly with fellow soldiers. The mood was subdued, contemplative. Night winds blew sand across the barren ground. The desert sky seemed almost endless, a faint wash of stars above them. Across Iraq, the night was equally tense but hushed. Some civilians stayed awake, listening to distant radios for news. Others tried to sleep. Baghdad itself lay under a faint orange haze from its city lights, its government buildings silhouetted against the darkness. There were rumors of impending strikes, but no one knew exactly when they would come or how severe they would be. The city held its breath. The opening shot. A targeted attempt. Before the main air campaign, the conflict began with something more focused. In the early morning hours of March 20, 2003, U.S. intelligence indicated that Saddam Hussein and senior Iraqi leaders might be located in a specific compound south of Baghdad. President George W. Bush authorized a precision strike in an attempt to target the leadership before they could disperse. A small number of cruise missiles and stealth aircraft carried out this early attack. The explosions echoed faintly across the region. These were not the massive bombardments that would follow, they were precise, directed, almost surgical. Yet even this initial round signaled unmistakably that the long-anticipated conflict had begun. In sleep-friendly form, imagine these missiles not as violent ruptures but as streaks of light moving silently across a deep blue sky. The advisors who ordered them stood in dimly lit rooms, watching screens with quiet focus. They spoke in hushed, deliberate tones, as though aware of the gravity of every word. The attempt to eliminate the Iraqi leadership in those first hours would ultimately prove unsuccessful, but the die had been cast. The world now understood the war was underway. Shock and awe begins. Later that day, and into the night of March 20, the coalition launched the full air campaign. This was the phase designed to rapidly incapacitate Iraq's military structure. In its original doctrine, shock and awe referred to overwhelming power applied with such decisiveness that resistance would collapse in spirit as well as in capability. In the sleep-softened retelling, imagine Baghdad at night, the river Tigris glimmering faintly beneath the moonlight. The city's skyline, a blend of domes, government towers, and dense residential blocks, stood quietly against the horizon. Then, the sky lit up with brief flashes, orange, white, gold. Missiles arced through the air from distant launch platforms. Plumes of fire rose from targeted buildings, dispersing into thick columns of smoke illuminated by city lights. The vibrations rolled across rooftops and trembled through windows. Dogs barked in distant neighborhoods. People huddled indoors, listening closely, waiting for moments of quiet between the booms. This bombardment was not a single explosive moment but a long sequence of precisely timed strikes. Government ministries, military communication centers, air defense installations, and command structures were all hit. The coalition aimed to dismantle Iraq's ability to coordinate, respond, or sustain organized combat. In military operations centers, large screens displayed real-time satellite imagery. Officers spoke into headsets, marking off each successful strike. The hum of electronics filled the room. Key personnel moved calmly, their faces lit by the blue glow of monitors. Outside, the desert remained silent. Iraq's response. Within Baghdad and other major Iraqi cities, air raid sirens sounded periodically. Anti-aircraft guns fired into the night sky, bright red traces streaking upward as defensive crews tried to intercept incoming missiles. These attempts seldom succeeded against the advanced technology of the coalition forces, but they became a visual symbol of Iraq's effort to resist. Meanwhile, Iraqi state television continued broadcasting, sometimes showing defiant messages from government officials, sometimes airing previously recorded footage of Saddam Hussein to assure citizens that he remained alive and in control. The broadcasts were meant to project stability, even as the infrastructure around them shuddered under bombardment. Iraqi troops dug deeper defensive positions. Republican Guard units waited outside the capital, ready to face the ground invasion they knew was coming. In sleep-friendly tones, imagine these soldiers sitting quietly beneath darkened skies, the cool air settling on their uniforms, their breath visible in the night. Their faces were illuminated only by small lanterns or cigarettes glowing faintly in the darkness. The civilian experience. For Iraqi civilians, the first days of the war were filled with uncertainty. Some stayed in their homes, gathering in interior rooms where walls felt thickest. Others fled their neighborhoods, seeking shelter with relatives or in rural areas where they hoped strikes would be less frequent. Electricity flickered throughout the city. Some neighborhoods spent hours in darkness. Generators rumbled softly in courtyards. Families whispered prayers. Parents comforted their children. Kitchens were lit with candles. The smell of dust and burning fuel lingered in the air. In this gentle retelling, imagine these families gathered in circles, their homes dimly lit, speaking in calm whispers to soothe one another. The outside world boomed and echoed, but inside, there was a deep effort to create a sense of safety, of unity, of endurance. The international reaction. Around the world, millions watched the opening strikes unfold in real time through television broadcasts. The flickering lights above Baghdad became one of the most widely viewed images of the decade. News anchors spoke in measured tones. Analysts discussed the strategy. Governments issued statements of concern, support, or condemnation, depending on their stance. In the Middle East, neighbors anxiously monitored developments, aware that the conflict could reshape regional dynamics. Europe remained deeply split, with some nations supporting the coalition and others strongly opposing the decision to invade. Some cities held protests late into the night. Others remained quiet as people simply watched, waiting to see what would come next. The bombardment continues. The air campaign continued for several nights, each one different but sharing a similar rhythm, missiles streaking across the sky, sirens wailing, anti-aircraft fire arcing upward, and buildings trembling. Some targets were struck multiple times to ensure they were fully disabled. By the end of these early phases, much of Iraq's centralized command system had been severely damaged or destroyed. From a narrative perspective, it was as though a long, heavy storm had settled over the nation, a storm of sound and light, breaking across the dark landscape. Yet, as with all storms, its purpose was to prepare the way for something else. That next phase was the ground invasion. And so Part 5 ends here, in the final echo of the opening bombardment, with the ground forces poised to move. Part 6. The ground invasion begins. When the first rays of sun touched the desert horizon on March 20, 2003, the war that had been rumbling in the skies began to unfold across the earth itself. The ground invasion of Iraq, long prepared for, heavily supplied, and meticulously planned, advanced quietly at first, almost like a great caravan stirring after a cold night. Tanks, armored vehicles, and long convoys of support units stood poised in Kuwait, engines humming at low idle, the desert air vibrating with the soft mechanical breathing of thousands of machines. This was the moment when Operation Iraqi Freedom shifted from distant bombardments to physical movement. The coalition's forces were about to cross the border. The road to Basra lay open, and beyond that, the long highway stretching north toward Baghdad. But the atmosphere, in this sleep-gentle telling, felt less like the build-up to a violent push and more like a massive, deliberate migration, slow and steady, as though the desert itself were parting to allow the passage. A slow awakening in the desert. The desert at dawn has a unique stillness. Before the heat of the day, before the winds begin to rise, a coolness settles over the sands. Soldiers waking in their tents or on their cots felt this coolness brushing their uniforms. Some scribbled last thoughts into notebooks. Others sipped warm coffee in paper cups, staring across the pale expanse of Kuwait's desert toward the invisible line that separated them from Iraq. Officers walked between vehicles speaking softly to their teams. Mechanics tightened bolts one last time. Medics checked their packs. Drivers ran gloved hands along the edges of windshields, pushing away the morning condensation. The entire coalition force stretched across a wide swath of desert. Americans, British, Australians, and others. The 3rd Infantry Division, the 1st Marine Division, British Armoured Units, Special Operations Teams. Thousands of vehicles, thousands of soldiers, all aligned in long, deliberate rows. The scale alone lent the moment a surreal, dreamlike quality. As the sun rose, turning the horizon gold, the order came. Troops boarded their vehicles. Engines roared to life in unison, creating a deep, resonant hum that rippled through the sand. And then the line began to move. Crossing the border. The border between Kuwait and Iraq, though invisible in the desert itself, was heavily fortified with fences, trenches, checkpoints, and military guards. For weeks, engineers had prepared designated crossing points known as breaches, clearing mines, installing temporary ramps, and opening lanes for vehicles. In the soft retelling here, imagine those breaches as narrow, glowing pathways carved through the desert. Long convoys approached them slowly, headlights dim in the morning light, leaving swirling trails of dust behind. As each vehicle crossed, a subtle tension eased. Soldiers who had waited for this moment for months now felt the surreal shift between preparation and action. Once across, the landscape looked almost identical, flat stretches of sand and sparse vegetation, but the meaning changed instantly. They were no longer in staging, they were in theater. Every mile forward carried weight. The race toward Basra. To the southeast lay Iraq's second-largest city, Basra, a hub of commerce and oil infrastructure. British forces took primary responsibility in this region. Their units moved along the coast and through the marshy lands, advancing toward the city with caution and determination. The early engagements here were scattered and inconsistent. Some Iraqi units surrendered almost immediately, emerging from positions with white cloths raised or hands open. Others fought briefly and then withdrew. The British forces encountered pockets of resistance near the port of Mkaza, a strategic supply point essential for future operations. In this series' calming tone, picture these early skirmishes not as frantic battles, but as distant murmurs in the vast open plains. Occasional bursts of fire, faint echoes carried by the wind, and long stretches of quiet as the coalition secured ports, bridges, and neighborhoods. The takeover of Mkaza took longer than expected, but eventually, British troops secured the area. Humanitarian ships soon followed, bringing supplies along the newly opened maritime route. The Marine Corps pushes north. To the west of Basra, the United States Marines advanced along Highway 6. Their journey required speed, persistence, and careful coordination. Columns of armored vehicles stretched for miles. Helicopters hovered above, scouting ahead, while artillery units positioned themselves to provide support if needed. The Marines encountered resistance near the city of Nasiriyah, where bridges and key roadways became contested points. But in the earliest days, much of their advance was characterized by movement rather than combat. They traveled through small villages where residents watched from rooftops or doorways, uncertain, wary, yet curious. In this quiet retelling, imagine each Marine convoy as a long, rolling shadow moving across the desert floor. Soldiers inside the vehicles remained alert but also contemplative, staring at the passing landscape, the endless sand, the occasional clusters of palm trees, the sparse huts, wondering what awaited them farther north. The Thunder Run approach by the Army. Farther west, the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division made rapid progress along routes leading toward the Euphrates River. Their goal was to reach Baghdad quickly, bypassing prolonged urban engagements whenever possible. The Army's tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles moved with remarkable speed. Satellite guidance, reconnaissance drones, and air support created a corridor through which the division advanced in disciplined formation. The soldiers inside these vehicles, many of them young men and women far from home for the first time, felt a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. At night, the convoys camped in predetermined positions. Soldiers rested beside their vehicles, using the armored hulls as shelter from the wind. The desert nights were cold, and the stars above seemed unusually bright, as if the sky were watching the unfolding events with solemn attention. In this softened retelling, these nights feel timeless, fires crackling softly, soldiers wrapped in blankets, the silhouettes of tanks standing like silent guardians against the horizon. The first serious resistance. Although the early days of the invasion saw many Iraqi units surrender or withdraw, pockets of fierce resistance emerged near Nasiriyah and along the highways approaching the Euphrates. In the quiet, sleep-friendly atmosphere of this narrative, these clashes are like sudden storms in an otherwise still landscape, intense but localized, flaring briefly before fading. Smoke rising gently into the sky, radio transmissions crackling with hurried instructions, medics moving swiftly and steadily through the dust. These moments reminded everyone that the war would not be a simple or uniform progression. Civilian life along the way. As coalition forces moved north, they passed through towns where civilians continued their daily lives as best they could. Children waved hesitantly from doorways. Farmers tended their animals, glancing up as convoys rolled past. Market stalls remained open in some places, their bright produce contrasting strikingly with the dust and tension of the roads. Some civilians approached coalition troops cautiously, seeking water, reassurance, or information. Others kept their distance. In several towns, uncertainty and fear shaped daily choices. Would the fighting reach them? Would the lights stay on? Would water remain available? In this sleep-driven narrative, imagine families sitting together in their homes, candles burning gently, listening for news on small radios. The war felt both close and far, like a distant storm that might or might not reach their street. The advance continues. By the end of the first week, coalition forces had established a firm foothold in southern Iraq and were moving steadily toward the heartland. Supply lines, though vulnerable, were extended and fortified. Engineers built temporary bridges over canals. Tank crews cleaned dust from their tracks. Helicopter units refueled and prepared for reconnaissance flights at dawn. The pace of the invasion surprised many observers. Coalition forces had advanced hundreds of miles in mere days. Yet within this momentum lay a quiet determination, a focus on reaching Baghdad and ending the regime's control. Part 6 closes here on this sense of steady movement. A great caravan of armored vehicles and personnel, rolling forward under a wide desert sky. The ground invasion had only just begun, but its direction was clear. Part 7. The Long March North. In the days following the initial breach into Iraq, the coalition's advance settled into a steady, unhurried rhythm, a slow but relentless northward movement that seemed to mirror the long sweep of history itself. Tanks, trucks, armored personnel carriers, and convoys of support vehicles crept along desert highways in lines that stretched for miles, their engines rumbling like distant thunder rolling across an empty plain. This phase of the war, often overshadowed by dramatic battles and political turning points, unfolded as a long journey through vast, open spaces. It was a march defined as much by endurance, patience, and the careful choreography of logistics as by combat. For soldiers living inside these days, time seemed to blend together. Dawn followed dusk, and dusk faded into the silent desert nights. Between major engagements, they traveled through areas that felt suspended between tension and quiet, between anticipation and monotony. In the sleep-friendly retelling here, picture this period as a wide, slow-moving river of machinery and people, flowing calmly but purposefully toward Baghdad. The endless desert roads. Northern-bound highways in southern Iraq were long and extraordinarily straight. To the left and right, the desert fanned out in shades of tan, gold, and muted brown. The heat radiating off the ground during midday made the horizon shimmer like a mirage. But mornings and evenings brought cool winds that swept sand lightly across the road, creating thin dunes that clung to the asphalt like drifting snow. Convoys rolled through this landscape at controlled speeds. Each vehicle followed strict spacing rules to minimize risk from ambushes or explosives. Dust clouds billowed behind tires and treads, creating pale, swirling clouds that caught the sunlight in soft halos. Inside these vehicles, soldiers watched the scenery slide by, low, crumbling buildings, date palms clustered near irrigation canals, herds of goats tended by shepherds in dark cloaks, small clusters of homes with laundry fluttering in the wind. Even in wartime, daily life went on. For those trying to sleep or rest between shifts, the hum of engines became a kind of lullaby. Vibrations from the road lulled them. The steady movement of the convoy felt like a long train journey, monotonous, rhythmic, strangely soothing. Supply lines stretch and sway. An army moves not only through force but through fuel, food, water, ammunition, and medical care. During the long march north, the coalition supply lines extended hundreds of miles from Kuwait. Managers of logistics knew how crucial it was to keep the flow constant. Fuel tankers rumbled behind armored vehicles. Tractor-trailers loaded with bottled water, ration crates, spare parts, and medical supplies followed designated paths. Helicopters shuttled equipment. Engineers repaired roads and cleared obstacles. The complexity of this operation was immense, yet in this gentle retelling, imagine it like a vast, interconnected clockwork, dozens of gears, each spinning in harmony, keeping the entire mechanism moving forward. At dusk each day, temporary camps appeared like small villages of lights and shapes scattered across the desert floor. Generators hummed. Soldiers unrolled sleeping mats beside their vehicles. Crews worked quietly under the orange glow of chemical lamps, refueling tanks and preparing them for the next day's journey. These nightly pauses have a dreamlike quality in memory. The desert sky opened above them, full of stars so bright they seemed to spill across the darkness. Voices murmured softly. Radios cracked with updates. The scent of dust mixed with diesel hung in the air. For many soldiers, these brief pauses felt like the eye of a storm, a moment to breathe before the next stretch of road. Encounters with civilians. As the march continued, the coalition passed through more populated towns and villages. Children stood barefoot at the roadside waving hesitantly. Elderly men watched silently from shaded doorways. Women stepped aside with their families, holding hands as convoys rolled past. Sometimes, local Iraqis approached coalition forces with questions, gestures of concern, or simple requests for water. Language barriers made communication fragmented, but human expressions, fear, curiosity, relief, transcended words. Some towns were quiet and calm, others bore signs of decades of neglect and hardship. Infrastructure was often outdated or damaged. Power lines sagged over uneven streets. Markets displayed only modest offerings. It became clear to many soldiers just how deeply life in Iraq had been shaped by years of sanctions, war, and authoritarian rule. Yet there was resilience in these communities. Farmers continued tending animals. Children played among old stone walls. Shopkeepers opened stores when the passing convoys brought brief calm to the streets. Life did not stop, it simply adapted. The weather turns. As the coalition pressed farther north, the weather shifted. Sandstorms, known in Iraq as shamals, swept across the desert unpredictably. They arrived first as distant, hazy pillars on the horizon, then grew into towering walls of dust and wind that swallowed roads, vehicles, and sky. Inside these storms, day turned to a muted amber twilight. Vision dropped to only a few feet. Soldiers tied scarves around their faces and goggles over their eyes. Machines slowed to a crawl. Communication relied on short-range radios and careful spacing. In this sleep-friendly version, imagine a sandstorm not as chaos, but as a quiet, enveloping cloud, a natural curtain closing over the landscape, muffling sound and motion. Vehicles glowed faintly through the haze like lanterns behind thin fabric. The desert, usually open and expansive, became small and intimate, wrapped in swirling grains of sand. And yet, even in the midst of these storms, the march north continued. Slowly, patiently, deliberately. A patchwork of resistance. The further the coalition advanced, the more often they encountered Iraqi paramilitary groups, irregular forces, and isolated pockets of resistance. These engagements were unpredictable. Sometimes fighters would ambush from tree lines or from within towns, then vanish. Other times they fortified intersections or attempted to block roads. But much of the time, resistance was sporadic, uncoordinated, and localized. Most Iraqi soldiers in regular units had already withdrawn, surrendered, or returned to their homes. In this retelling, imagine these moments as brief gusts of wind interrupting a calm evening. The tension rose, then fell. Smoke drifted into the sky. Vehicles paused, then resumed movement. The overarching journey, steady, continuous, carried on. Resting in makeshift camps. Between long stretches of travel, troops paused at temporary staging areas. Sometimes abandoned Iraqi bases, sometimes open fields along canals, sometimes wide patches of roadside clearings. At night, the desert's coolness returned, settling gently over everything. Soldiers set up simple perimeter defenses, checked equipment, heated meals, and exchanged quiet conversations. Some wrote letters home beneath dim red lights. Others sat on ammunition crates sipping coffee. A few stretched out on blankets to watch satellites drift across the sky. In this soothing narrative, you can imagine the camps as small islands of light in a vast ocean of darkness. Campfires flickered low. Generators pulsed softly. The diesel engines of parked vehicles ticked as they cooled. If one listened closely, the faint sound of distant dogs barking or wind stirring through dry grasses could be heard. These nights were a reminder that even within war, there were still moments of pause. Moments where the human need for rest, reflection, and connection gently resurfaced. Approaching the Euphrates. As the march north continued, the terrain slowly changed. The flat expanses gave way to areas marked by irrigation canals, farmland, and clusters of palm groves. Water, scarce in the southern desert, became more common. Birds gathered near marshy areas. The scent of vegetation mingled with the ever-present dust. Crossing the Euphrates River was a major objective, a symbolic and logistical threshold. The Euphrates had sustained civilizations for thousands of years, and now it stood quietly beneath the shadows of bridges, waiting for the next chapter of history to pass over it. The coalition advanced toward this ancient waterway with care. Engineers inspected bridges. Reconnaissance teams monitored resistance. But in the overarching rhythm of the campaign, the movement remained patient and steady, foreshadowing the road ahead. By the end of this long march phase, coalition forces had traveled extraordinary distances in only a matter of days. They had secured key supply routes, established forward support bases, and continued pushing toward central Iraq. Yet the greatest challenges still lay ahead. Baghdad, with its dense urban landscape and symbolic importance, waited like a distant silhouette on the northern horizon. In this calming retelling, Part 7 closes with that image. The faint outline of a city not yet seen but felt. A quiet awareness among the troops that each mile brought them closer to the heart of the conflict. Part 8. Crossing the Euphrates. As the long march north continued, coalition forces approached one of the most historically resonant features of the Iraqi landscape, the Euphrates River. For thousands of years, the Euphrates had been a lifeline for civilizations, a pathway for traders, and a boundary for empires. Now, in the quiet retelling of this modern conflict, it became a kind of symbolic threshold, a line separating the early, sweeping movements of the invasion from the far more complex tasks that waited farther north. In these days of travel, the desert began to change gradually. What had once been open stretches of tan and pale gold started giving way to subtler hues, patches of green along irrigation canals, thin groves of date palms, and cultivated fields that followed the river's winding path. Birds flew low over waterlogged areas, their wings casting brief shadows across the ground. The air carried a faint scent of vegetation, something almost sweet after the dryness of the southern desert. Coalition troops noticed these changes in mood as well as sight. The landscape softened, the wind felt different. Even in wartime, these subtle transitions served as reminders of how ancient and layered Iraq's geography truly was. While engines hummed and convoys advanced, the presence of the Euphrates seemed to whisper of civilizations long gone, Sumerian cities, Babylonian kings, caravans of traders from centuries past. In the quiet of early morning or dusk, it was easy to feel as though the past hovered close. The strategic significance. Reaching the Euphrates was not as simple as arriving at a riverbank. For modern armies, rivers represent both opportunity and risk. The coalition needed functioning bridges to maintain momentum, and engineers had been studying satellite imagery and reports for weeks, examining which crossings might still be intact, which might be fortified, and which might be destroyed by retreating forces. This stage of the campaign required caution. Troops approached slowly, sending reconnaissance vehicles and unmanned surveillance flights ahead. The goal was not simply to rush forward, but to understand the terrain, the condition of infrastructure, and the level of resistance. In the soft, sleep-friendly version here, imagine this process as a quiet and deliberate dance, scouts moving ahead, engineers preparing equipment, officers studying maps with muted red lights, all contributing to a seamless, organized flow. Though the river represented a major geographical obstacle, the coalition had been preparing for this moment from the earliest planning stages. They carried portable bridging equipment, construction tools, and support vehicles capable of creating temporary spans if necessary. But the preferred option, of course, was to find bridges that could be crossed with minimal repair. And there were several, spanning the river near towns that had grown around these crossing points for centuries. Approaching the bridges, the first glimpse of the river often came suddenly, a thin line of shimmering blue-green cutting across the landscape, bordered by the darker silhouettes of palm trees. As convoys neared the water, the heat shimmer gave way to clearer visibility. Soldiers looked out from their vehicles to see fishing boats tied up along the banks, the occasional herder leading animals across the shallows, and, in the distance, low cement bridges spanning the flow like quiet sentinels. These bridges held layers of meaning. For civilians, they were lifelines, connections to markets, schools, family members in nearby provinces. For the coalition, they were pathways deeper into the country. For Iraqi military units, they were strategic points to defend or abandon depending on the situation. Some bridges were lightly damaged but still passable. Others had been blocked with debris, abandoned vehicles, or makeshift barriers. A few had been partially destroyed, leaving engineers to assess whether repair or replacement was possible. In the calming retelling here, imagine engineers examining these structures with methodical care, checking supports, measuring spans, listening to the river swirl quietly beneath them. They worked with steady professionalism even when the surrounding environment was tense. Civilians along the river. Along the Euphrates, civilian life continued in ways that seemed almost timeless. Families walked along footpaths carrying baskets of produce. Farmers tended fields with the help of small irrigation pumps. Children splashed at the water's edge or sat beneath palm trees to escape the afternoon heat. The presence of coalition forces brought curiosity and uncertainty, but the river itself remained a constant rhythm in their lives. Some locals watched from rooftops as convoys approached. Others approached soldiers cautiously, offering gestures to communicate. Coalition troops, mindful of cultural differences and security concerns, responded with equal caution. In many instances, interactions remained quiet, brief, and peaceful, humans seeking simply to understand what the next hours or days might bring. Crossing with care. When the coalition finally began moving units across the bridges, the process unfolded slowly and deliberately. Tanks rolled forward one or two at a time, their heavy treads echoing over the cement. Supply trucks followed in measured intervals. Engineers walked alongside, monitoring the structure for stress. Military police directed traffic to prevent bottlenecks. Overhead, helicopters circled in wide loops, watching for signs of movement or resistance. In the distance, radio towers blinked faintly. The smell of river water mingled with diesel fumes. And throughout all of this, the flow of the Euphrates continued below, unaffected by the commotion above. Its ancient current sliding onward just as it had for millennia. Crossing the river represented both a practical achievement and a psychological milestone. Coalition troops understood that once they were on the far side, the remaining distance to Baghdad felt shorter. The campaign had reached a new stage. Night along the Euphrates. One of the most striking aspects of this phase was the beauty of the river at night. For those who paused on its banks during evening halts, the Euphrates reflected moonlight in gentle ripples. The silhouettes of palm trees formed patterned borders against the sky. Where generators powered temporary camp lanterns, their glow softened in the mist rising off the water. In this quiet retelling, Imagine soldiers setting up their temporary encampments, arranging equipment, heating meals, and speaking softly beneath the stars. Radios crackled with updates but were kept at low volume. Some troops sat along the banks, absorbing the rare sense of calm. Others wrote letters or reflected quietly on how far they had traveled. The Euphrates offered a kind of stillness, a reminder that nature continues its rhythms even in the midst of conflict. That moment of pause, however brief, was grounding. It reminded many troops that they were part of something much larger than the immediate mission. Pressing forward again. Once the crossings were secured and supply lines stabilized, the coalition resumed its push north. The goal was not only Baghdad, but also the surrounding regions that formed the heart of Iraq's political and economic centers. Troops moved with renewed momentum, though never in haste. They passed towns built from pale stone, areas dotted with farmland, and roads lined with old telephone poles. From this point forward, the campaign would grow more complicated. The capital lay ahead, and with it a dense urban landscape where the lines between military targets and civilian zones blurred. The Euphrates crossing marked the end of the campaign's expansive early phase, the wide sweeps across open terrain, and the beginning of a more focused approach toward the political core of the country. But for now, in the calm of this chapter, imagine the crossing not as a moment of tension, but as a peaceful transition. An army flowing like a river across another river, merging movement with geography. Part 9. The road to Baghdad. After crossing the Euphrates, the coalition's advance took on a new tone, more focused, more deliberate, yet still unfolding with the slow, measured rhythm characteristic of long military operations. Ahead lay the capital city of Iraq, its name woven into centuries of history, culture, and regional identity. Baghdad was not just a geographic destination. It represented the center of political power, symbolism, infrastructure, and influence. Reaching it would mark the turning point of the campaign, but the journey there was neither rushed nor chaotic. In this calming retelling, it becomes a quiet procession through a landscape layered with stories. The landscape changes. The terrain north of the Euphrates began to show subtler variations. Fields grew more frequent, and irrigation canals became wider and more sophisticated, weaving through farmland like a network of shining threads. Palm groves appeared more regularly in clusters, their fronds waving slightly in the persistent Iraqi breeze. The ground shifted from the pale beige of the southern desert to the darker, more fertile soil of central Iraq, soil that had supported civilizations for thousands of years. Convoys rolled onward, their paths winding through terrain shaped by agriculture and river-based life. Soldiers looked out from their armored vehicles at green patches, date orchards, and occasional grazing animals. These sights softened the monotony that had characterized the early weeks of the march. Even in the midst of war, the land reminded them of its enduring cycles. Small villages dotted the roadside, their houses made of light-colored brick or concrete. Some had satellite dishes perched on rooftops, others had open courtyards where families gathered. Children sometimes clustered in groups, waving shyly as armored vehicles passed. Adults watched cautiously from doorways, unsure of what the next hours or days might bring. The psychological shift. The coalition's mindset shifted as the distance to Baghdad decreased. The early phase of long, open travel, rapid movement across deserts and rural stretches, gave way to more complex considerations. Approaching a major metropolitan center meant preparing for intersections, dense neighborhoods, government complexes, industrial zones, and multi-layered security environments. But in this sleep-focused narrative, Imagine those preparations taking shape in a calm, methodical fashion. Officers studied maps under dim lighting during evening halts, tracing highways with gloved fingertips. Logistics teams recalculated supply needs with quiet precision. Communication specialists tested equipment repeatedly to ensure uninterrupted contact with support units. Above all, troops understood that they were entering a region where history, culture, and identity converged. Baghdad had been the heart of multiple empires, a center of science during the Islamic Golden Age, and home to millions of people. The road to the city felt like a path into the center of a living, breathing tapestry. Towns and checkpoints. Along the way, the coalition encountered a series of towns and suburban communities that functioned almost like outer rings around the capital. These areas varied widely in character. Some were calm and quiet, with light foot traffic and closed shops. Others showed signs of recent military abandonment, empty guard posts, abandoned vehicles, or scattered debris. Coalition troops approached each town with caution but also with a deliberate gentleness. They conducted reconnaissance first, then advanced gradually, avoiding unnecessary confrontation. Many towns offered little resistance. Local people often sheltered indoors or watched quietly from a distance. Some expressed relief that fighting had not erupted on their streets. These moments reflected the complexity of the war. Not every community chose to fight, and not every area had the resources or leadership to resist. In this gentle retelling, imagine soldiers moving through these towns not with tension, but with steady awareness. Engines idled softly. Radios whispered updates. The convoy wound its way forward like a river adjusting to the bends in its course. Skirmishes along the way. Although full-scale battles were rare on this stretch, there were sporadic moments of resistance from paramilitary groups or isolated loyalist units. These encounters tended to flare briefly, then dissipate. In this narrative, think of them as passing gusts of wind, moments of sharp energy interrupting an otherwise quiet evening. The coalition responded swiftly, then continued the advance. Smoke sometimes drifted upward from distant fields or industrial sites, carried gently by the wind until it thinned into the hazy blue of the sky. The landscape around Baghdad bore signs of tension, but also resilience. Markets reopened when the road seemed calm. Farmers tended crops even as armored vehicles rolled by. Life continued its rhythms, however altered. Night halts close to Baghdad. As the coalition grew closer to the capital, nighttime encampments took on a new tone. The glow of Baghdad could sometimes be seen faintly on the horizon, a soft dome of light against an otherwise dark desert. Soldiers noticed it during their routine pauses, a reminder that the city was no longer just a point on a map. In these camps, the routine unfolded with practiced efficiency. Vehicles pulled into rows. Perimeter security was established. Soldiers removed helmets and gear, their movement slow and tired but steady. Some sat on overturned crates or the steps of their vehicles, drinking water and speaking quietly. Others lay back and gazed up at the sky, where stars shimmered with startling clarity away from the city's lights. The night air was cool and carried the earthy scent of irrigated fields. Distant dogs barked occasionally. A faint hum, perhaps of generators, or wind flowing through palm fronds, filled the silence. These camps, though temporary, felt like small islands of calm in the greater movement of the campaign. Highways leading into the capital. Approaching Baghdad required choosing among several major highways, each with its own set of considerations. Some were more direct but passed through denser urban zones. Others wound around industrial districts or skirted military installations. The coalition studied all options carefully, aiming to minimize civilian harm while maintaining operational effectiveness. Bridges, overpasses, culverts, and intersections became points of particular interest. Engineers analyzed structural integrity. Recon teams examined traffic patterns. Helicopters scanned rooftops and roadways. Yet despite the complexity, in this gentle retelling, imagine these preparations unfolding like a well-rehearsed sequence. Teams operating in harmony, each group supporting the others. The feeling of history approaching. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the road to Baghdad was the growing sense that this was not merely a modern military operation, but a passage through centuries of human experience. The land itself seemed to carry memories of ancient empires, shifting borders, monumental triumphs, and profound tragedies. Baghdad, founded in the 8th century as the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, had once been a global center of knowledge, scholarship, commerce, and culture. Even now, beneath the tension and uncertainty of the early 2000s, that legacy remained in the air, something felt rather than seen. Troops nearing the city often described a kind of quiet awareness settling over them. They understood the weight of the history they were approaching. No matter the political complexities, no matter the realities of conflict, the cultural significance of Baghdad could not be ignored. In this sleep-friendly retelling, imagine the road narrowing slightly, the palm groves becoming denser, the signs of habitation increasing. Imagine the distant hum of urban life growing clearer as miles slip by. The final stretch. As coalition forces reached the outskirts of Baghdad's southern and western approaches, they paused to regroup. This pause was not born of reluctance, but of prudence. The final push into a capital city required attention to detail, coordination across units, and careful timing. And so Part 9 closes on a moment of stillness, a breath before the descent into a dense, historic metropolis. The engines quiet. The desert wind moves through the grass. The faint glow of Baghdad illuminates the horizon. Part 10. Encircling the capital. As coalition forces drew nearer to Baghdad, the nature of the campaign shifted once again. The long, steady march across sparsely populated regions gave way to a more deliberate and nuanced approach. The capital was not a place that could be reached with haste. It required preparation, coordination, and a deep understanding of urban dynamics. In this sleep-friendly version of events, imagine Part 10 as a wide, quiet circle forming around a city of immense historical weight. A circle drawn not in aggression, but in careful, methodical observation. The first glimpse of Baghdad. Troops reported seeing the faint glow of the city long before they reached its borders. Baghdad's lights, though dimmed by years of sanctions and strained infrastructure, still cast a gentle halo against the horizon. At night, this glow pulsed faintly, as though the city breathed with its own energy. In the distance, minarets and towers appeared as silhouettes against the sky. Shapes that hinted at the city's long and storied past. Approaching Baghdad meant moving through densely layered outer districts, some agricultural, others suburban, and still others industrial. The coalition's movement was careful, almost like footsteps taken in a quiet room where someone is asleep. Each mile brought new terrain and new considerations. Soldiers noticed the increase in small shops, roadside stalls, narrow bridges, and walled compounds. The textures of the environment changed, becoming richer, more varied, more distinctly urban. The outer ring, farms and fields. Before reaching the capital's outskirts, the coalition passed through rings of farmland nourished by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These fields were green and fertile, with irrigation channels weaving between them. Farmers moved slowly across the land, guiding animals or tending to crops with practiced gestures that seemed unchanged by time. Livestock bleated from stone pens. Children carried bundles of reeds or vegetables. Women walked with baskets balanced gracefully. Even in the shadow of war, these communities continued their routines, shaped more by the rhythms of the land than by the movements of armies. The coalition maintained respectful distance as much as possible, avoiding disruptions to daily life. Soldiers often watched quietly from their vehicles, struck by how serene the scene felt despite the tension surrounding the region. Transition into suburban districts. Beyond the farmland, the roads funneled into increasingly populated areas. The houses grew closer together, forming compact neighborhoods with narrow streets and low cement walls. Shops displayed goods such as bread, fruit, clothing, and small electronics. Satellite dishes adorned many rooftops, angled upward like quiet metal flowers seeking the sky. Laundry lines fluttered gently between buildings. In this phase, the coalition approached neighborhoods with great care. Some streets were abandoned except for a few curious onlookers standing at a distance. Others teemed with daily activity, albeit muted by the uncertain atmosphere. Occasionally a shopkeeper would stand outside a storefront, arms crossed, watching silently as the convoys rolled by. The coalition did not immediately enter the most densely populated areas. Instead, they moved around them, forming a wide perimeter. This was the beginning of the encirclement, methodical, calculated, and steady. Industrial zones and highway interchanges. Farther along the outer ring, industrial areas appeared, clusters of warehouses, factories, processing plants, and depots. Many looked outdated or partially inactive, remnants of decades of economic strain. Rusted metal gates hung slightly crooked. Empty trucks sat in lots coated with dust. In some areas, debris littered the ground, hinting at the pressures Iraq had faced long before this conflict began. Highways converged near these industrial zones, creating webs of overpasses, loops, and interchanges. For troops accustomed to open desert roads, this environment required heightened awareness. Vehicles slowed. Communication increased. Patrols surveyed the area. Yet even here, the atmosphere in this retelling remained steady and calm. Engines rumbled softly. Radios murmured. Soldiers scanned gently from behind shaded visors. The city seemed to be breathing in front of them, immense, layered, and waiting. Coalition strategy, the gentle surrounding. The coalition strategy did not rely on plunging directly into Baghdad's heart. Instead, they focused on establishing control around the city's perimeter. This approach had several purposes. Maintain supply routes without interruptions. Monitor movement in and out of the capital. Avoid overwhelming confrontation by allowing civilians opportunities to remain safe. Gradually reduce the ability of Iraqi forces to coordinate a unified defense. This phase unfolded almost like the drawing of a wide, careful circle on a map. Coalition units spread outward along major highways, establishing observation points, perimeter security, and controlled intersections. They avoided unnecessary confrontation when possible, preferring steady progress over rapid escalation. In this gentle retelling, picture the encirclement as a quiet settling, a gradual folding of external positions around a central point, not unlike clouds forming a ring around a mountain peak. Civilian movements and reactions. Civilians responded to the coalition's presence in varied ways. Some stayed inside their homes, watching events through curtained windows. Others gathered cautiously in small groups outside, conversing in low tones. Many moved toward relatives' homes farther from potential conflict zones, carrying belongings in plastic bags or balancing items carefully in their arms. Cars, trucks, and bicycles appeared sporadically on the roads. The coalition allowed civilian traffic to continue whenever safe and feasible. Military police directed vehicles around convoys with patient hand signals. In this calm reconstruction, imagine those moments as soft interactions rather than chaotic ones, humans navigating uncertainty with small gestures of courtesy. Urban geography requires patience. Cities, especially ones as large and complex as Baghdad, influence the way militaries move. Urban landscapes create layers of visibility, concealment, and vulnerability. Buildings channel movement. Roads create choke points. Overpasses and alleys offer unexpected angles. The coalition understood this deeply. Their approach emphasized patience, map study, aerial reconnaissance, slow ground assessment, and thoughtful planning. The encirclement was not a mere tactical maneuver, it was a process of learning the city's outer rhythms before stepping into its beating heart. Here, in the sleep-friendly tone, imagine commanders leaning over maps with soft lighting, discussing routes in even voices. Imagine scouts returning from observation missions, sharing their findings calmly. Imagine the city resting under the twilight, unaware of the careful calculations unfolding beyond its edges. Nighttime near the capital. As evening fell over Baghdad's outskirts, the coalition established camps that glowed faintly with the orange light of portable lamps. The city's distant lights flickered in the background, merging with starlight overhead. Dogs barked faintly in distant neighborhoods. The soft hum of the Tigris River could sometimes be heard if the wind was right. Night near a major city felt different than the nights in the open desert. The air carried layers of sound, distant engines, muffled conversations from nearby homes, the flapping of laundry caught in the breeze, the faint crackle of old electrical lines overhead. Civilization was close, yet separated by a veil of tension and uncertainty. Coalition troops settled into restful routines. Some wrote notes in small journals. Some cleaned equipment with unhurried movements. Some simply reclined on camp chairs, watching the horizon as the glow of Baghdad shimmered gently in the darkness. These nights were a strange blend of anticipation and stillness, a pause before the next stage of the operation. The encirclement takes hold. By the time the coalition had fully established positions around the city, a loose but effective ring had formed. Key highway entrances were monitored. Major bridges had been assessed or secured. Industrial districts, agricultural outskirts, and suburban neighborhoods were all within view. The coalition did not cut off civilians from movement, instead, they created an environment where major military maneuvers could be observed, anticipated, and managed. In this narrative, imagine the encirclement not as a tightening grip but as a soft settling, like hands resting gently around the edges of a large, fragile vase. Baghdad was enormous, full of life and complexity. The coalition approached it with awareness of this reality. A breath before the descent into the city. Part 10 closes with the coalition firmly positioned around Baghdad but not yet inside it. The capital's historic skyline stands on the horizon, silhouetted against the dim sky. The city waits, quiet but restless. The coalition breathes, poised but deliberate. The next stage, the entry into Baghdad. would shape the course of the war, but it begins with this moment of stillness, this peripheral embrace around a city of millions. Part 11. The Tigris and the Southern Gate. The moment had come to face the second great river of Iraq. After crossing the Euphrates in earlier stages of the campaign, coalition forces now approached the Tigris, the waterway that wound through the heart of Baghdad and had shaped Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years. Approaching the Tigris felt like stepping closer to the core of the country, closer to the pulse of history itself. In this sleep-friendly retelling, the journey toward the river unfolds not with tension or urgency, but with a calm and steady grace, like drifting down a slow-moving current. The land between the rivers. Southern Baghdad lies in the region historically known as the land between the rivers, and as the coalition moved northward, the terrain reflected this transition. The dry, open spaces of earlier days gave way to richer soil, carefully tended farmland, and irrigation networks that spread across the land like delicate veins. Palm groves grew denser, their fronds rustling quietly in the spring breeze. The scent of water, cooler, fresher, different from the desert air, lingered in the atmosphere. The closer the troops came to the Tigris, the more the landscape seemed to pulse with life. Birds moved in flocks along the river's banks. Farmers guided donkeys and cattle through fields lined with reeds. Small stone bridges crossed narrow canals. Everywhere, flowing water brought a sense of continuity, an ancient reminder that this land had been cultivated and cherished long before the events of modern conflict. To soldiers who had spent weeks traversing arid terrain, the presence of water was grounding. It softened the edges of the world, cooling the air and settling the dust. The Tigris was not yet in sight, but its influence could already be felt. Signs of the city's outer neighborhoods. Approaching Baghdad from the south meant encountering a mix of semi-rural and suburban districts. Houses stood in close clusters, many with small courtyards shaded by pomegranate or fig trees. Walls were painted in pale earth tones, while roofs supported satellite dishes or clay jugs filled with cooling water. Narrow streets wound between these homes, sometimes bordered by low stone fences or ditches that carried runoff from irrigation. Shops began to appear more frequently along the roads. A bakery with its shutters halfway open. A barber shop with a faded sign. A small market with stacks of oranges and canned goods arranged neatly in the shade. Many businesses were closed, but their presence marked the shift from open land to a lived-in urban environment. Despite the encirclement and tension surrounding the capital, daily life persisted in quiet pockets. A man sweeping dust from his doorstep. A group of boys kicking a half-deflated soccer ball. Women emerging briefly to hang laundry in the sun. The coalition, aware of the presence of civilians, proceeded slowly, their vehicles humming at controlled speeds. In this retelling, imagine the convoy moving like a long shadow across the outskirts, present but not disruptive, steady but not intrusive. Bridges and barriers. The Tigris River, like the Euphrates, was crossed by numerous bridges, each of which carried strategic importance. Some were modern overpasses made of concrete and steel. Others were older structures, with weathered supports and narrow lanes. All required careful assessment. As coalition forces approached the southern gate of Baghdad, they needed to determine which bridges were usable, which were damaged, and which might be defended or blocked. Engineers studied structural integrity with quiet precision. Reconnaissance teams observed traffic patterns from a distance. Helicopters circled gently overhead, scanning rooftops, industrial sites, and open areas along the river's banks. The Tigris itself moved with a calm, steady flow, reflecting the muted sky above it. Its surface carried gentle ripples from passing boats, fishermen in wooden skiffs, families traveling quietly across the water, or occasional barges laden with goods. Through centuries of upheaval, the river had continued to flow, its presence a constant in an ever-changing world. The southern gate, a quiet approach. To the south of Baghdad lay several approaches that the coalition considered carefully. One of these was a wide highway leading directly toward government buildings and major intersections. Another route passed through a more residential stretch, lined with low homes and small shops. The coalition chose to move forward cautiously, preferring routes that minimized civilian risk. Their approach resembled a slow, deliberate unrolling of a map. Vehicles spread into carefully coordinated formations. Units communicated softly across radios. Scouts advanced ahead in small numbers, pausing frequently to observe and to ensure the way was clear. Though moments of resistance did occur in certain pockets, many areas remained surprisingly quiet. Some Iraqi soldiers had already withdrawn. Others had taken up defensive positions deeper within the city. A few paramilitary groups attempted ambushes but were quickly dispersed. In this soothing retelling, imagine these incidents not as jarring flashes, but as brief gusts of wind that momentarily disturb a calm evening before fading once more. Civilians at the river's edge. At the banks of the Tigris, civilians continued their routines as best they could. Families filled containers at communal water points. Fishermen cast nets from the shore. Children skipped stones across the surface, their laughter soft and fleeting. Even as signs of conflict appeared, burnt-out cars, abandoned guard posts, graffiti calling for resistance, life went on in small but meaningful ways. Some civilians watched the coalition from a distance, their expressions cautious but curious. A few approached with gestures indicating concern, questions, or simple attempts at communication. Soldiers, aware of cultural sensitivities, responded with caution and respect, offering water or directing families to safer pathways. The river had a calming effect on everyone. Its movement was slow, almost meditative. Reflections of palm trees rippled across its surface. Birds perched on exposed roots and reeds. In the midst of uncertainty, the Tigris remained steady, serene, and timeless. Nightfall by the Tigris. As dusk settled over the southern outskirts of Baghdad, the coalition established temporary positions along the river's edge. The fading sunlight painted the sky in soft hues of gold, rose, and muted lavender. The Tigris reflected these colors like a long sheet of silk unfurling in the breeze. Tents were pitched. Lights were dimmed. Soldiers sat on crates or vehicle steps, watching the sky turn darker. Some walked to the edge of the river, letting the cool air rise around them. The scent of wet earth mingled with the fragrance of date palms and drifting smoke from distant cooking fires. The calmness of these evenings offered a moment of reflection. In the soft glow of lanterns and the gentle sound of water, the enormity of Baghdad seemed both close and distant at once. The capital's skyline shimmered faintly to the north, its towers barely visible in the evening haze. A city of layers. Baghdad was a city woven from centuries of history. Founded in the 8th century, it had once been the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, a center of science, mathematics, literature, and culture. Even now, beneath the strain of conflict, it remained layered with stories, mosques with ancient domes, markets filled with spices, neighborhoods shaped by generations of families. As the coalition prepared to engage more deeply with the urban core, they felt the weight of this history. Each street had its own story. Each neighborhood held memories. The city was not simply a battlefield, it was a living community filled with people whose lives would be shaped by what came next. Preparing for the next step. Part 11 ends at this quiet threshold, the Tigris gliding steadily through the night, the outlines of Baghdad rising faintly in the distance, and the coalition preparing to navigate the intricate layers of the capital. The river marks both a literal and symbolic boundary. Crossing it would signify entering the heart of Iraq in every sense. But before that crossing came planning, reflection, and a deep breath, the kind taken before stepping into a vast, historic space. Part 12. Crossing into the city. Night had passed quietly along the Tigris, and as dawn slipped over the horizon, the coalition prepared for one of the most delicate phases of the entire campaign, the first movements into Baghdad itself. This moment did not arrive suddenly or with cinematic drama. Instead, it unfolded slowly, like the gradual brightening of the sky before sunrise. Soldiers moved with deliberate calm. Vehicles hummed at low idle. Maps were reviewed one last time under muted light. The city waited in a soft haze, its skyline wrapped in a mixture of dust, mist, and pale morning warmth. In this sleep-friendly retelling, imagine the entrance into Baghdad not as a rush or a clash, but as a cautious, steady crossing into a vast and layered urban world. It is a moment where tension exists, yet is softened by the quiet discipline and focus of those involved. The first movements toward the bridges. Baghdad is divided by the Tigris, its neighborhoods arranged in a fluid network across both sides of the river. In the early hours of entry, coalition units moved along several southern and southwestern corridors toward the bridges that threaded the city together. Engineers had already analyzed satellite imagery, drone reconnaissance, and reports from forward scouts. They knew some bridges were damaged, others intact, and a few likely rigged for demolition. The approach to these bridges was undertaken slowly, almost reverently. Tanks and armored vehicles edged forward in small formations, pausing often to listen, to observe, to assess. Soldiers scanned windows, rooftops, and alleyways for movement. Support units checked communications equipment. The air smelled faintly of damp stone, diesel, and the remnants of last night's small cooking fires near residential blocks. The sun rose quietly above the city, casting long shadows across the river. Its soft light shimmered off the water, breaking into tiny ripples where currents shifted. This early morning calm added to the surreal feeling of the moment, a city preparing unknowingly for a day that would alter its future forever. Neighborhoods on the edge of the capital. Before reaching the inner districts, the coalition passed through neighborhoods that formed the outer skin of Baghdad. These were areas filled with small homes, workshops, narrow markets, and local corner stores. Life here moved at a slower pace than in the bustling city center. Even during conflict, there were signs of ordinary routine that had not yet faded. A dog barked from behind a wall. A vendor arranged crates of vegetables outside his shop. Laundry hung limply on lines strung between rooftops. Civilians stepped outside occasionally, drawn by curiosity. Many remained cautious, watching quietly from a distance. Some families stood together near their doors, shielding their children. A few waved faintly, uncertain whether to express relief, fear, or simple acknowledgement. The quiet presence of these residents gave the coalition a silent reminder that the city was not merely a strategic objective, it was home to millions. Coalition vehicles maintained slow, respectful speeds, careful not to disrupt the fragile rhythms of these districts. The hum of engines blended with the city's natural soundscape, the murmur of radios in nearby apartments, the flutter of pigeons overhead, the creaking of old wooden gates brushed by the wind. Bridges as quiet thresholds. Reaching the first major bridges into the heart of Baghdad felt like arriving at a threshold. Each bridge, whether large and modern or narrow and worn, represented a physical crossing but also a symbolic transition. Baghdad had been shaped by its rivers for more than a millennium, and now, coalition forces stood poised to step across one of them. Engineers inspected each structure with quiet precision. They tapped along guardrails, checked supports, and monitored vibrations. Soldiers formed protective rings around the engineers, their silhouettes still and focused. Vehicles waited, engines whispering beneath the soft hum of morning. Some bridges bore minor damage, scorch marks, broken railings, or debris left by hurried defensive efforts. Others were remarkably intact, their concrete surfaces reflecting a muted glow. The Tigris flowed beneath them in widening ripples, carrying fragments of light downstream. In this calming retelling, the crossing itself becomes almost meditative. Vehicles eased forward 2 or 3 at a time. Tires rolled gently over the concrete spans. Soldiers watched both sides of the riverbank with measured attention. Above them, birds circled in wide arcs, their wings cutting through the rising heat. It was not dramatic. It was slow, cautious, deliberate, like walking into a quiet library where the weight of history rests on every shelf. First steps into the urban core. Once across the bridges, Baghdad's inner districts opened in a vast, intricate web. Streets stretched in every direction. Some wide and orderly, others narrow and winding. Buildings rose in mixed heights, a blend of aging concrete blocks, newer commercial structures, and domes or minarets that marked religious sites. The coalition did not press directly toward the city center. Instead, they moved into peripheral blocks first, establishing observation points and ensuring safe passage for following units. Troops paused often, taking note of the layout, the architecture, the sound patterns, and the presence of civilians. In one neighborhood, a group of children peered from behind a broken wall, their eyes wide but curious. In another, elderly men sat outside a shuttered cafe, watching with solemn expressions as the armored vehicles passed. From balconies, women gently guided family members indoors, wanting to avoid potential danger. Despite the tension underlying these interactions, the atmosphere remained strangely quiet, a calm unfolding between discrete moments of alertness. The city soundscape. Every city has a soundscape uniquely its own, and Baghdad was no different. In these early hours of coalition entry, the sounds felt subdued but deeply layered. Distant generators hummed in low tones. Water pumps clicked rhythmically. The call to prayer rose faintly from a mosque in the distance, the melodic notes drifting through the morning air. A door slammed somewhere far down a street. Car horns beeped occasionally as residents maneuvered through narrow lanes. The coalition's movements added their own sounds to this environment, the low rumble of engines, the clatter of tracks, the quiet tapping of radios, and the soft rustle of uniforms. In this retelling, these sounds blend into a kind of urban lullaby. A steady rhythm beneath the city's ancient pulse. Establishing calm positions. As the morning stretched into midday, coalition units settled into initial positions within the city. Some occupied open courtyards or large intersections, setting up temporary command posts. Others occupied lightly damaged industrial buildings or abandoned municipal structures where they could monitor movement without obstructing civilian life. Medical teams prepared stations. Technicians adjusted communication equipment. Engineers continued evaluating roads, bridges, and culverts. All of this unfolded with quiet professionalism. No one hurried. No one shouted. Every action was deliberate. From their vantage points, troops could see more of the city, long avenues lined with trees, parks with empty benches, markets where awnings flapped lazily in the wind. Baghdad was vast, complex, and deeply lived in. Entering it felt like stepping into the heart of a mosaic. Thousands of tiny pieces forming a single, intricate picture. The emotional weight of entry. Even with their training and preparation, many soldiers felt the emotional gravity of the moment. Baghdad was a city revered in history, a center of learning, poetry, astronomy, literature, and theological thought. To enter it was to cross into an enduring symbol of human civilization. The coalition carried this awareness with them. They understood the significance of each step, each decision, each interaction with civilians. The weight of responsibility settled gently on their shoulders, like dust on an old book pulled from a shelf. And yet, beneath all of this, there was a profound sense of stillness. The city was quiet, as though holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to move softly between the streets, toward the city's interior. By the end of Part 12, coalition forces had secured initial footholds across the river and were preparing to move deeper into Baghdad's interior. Ahead lay government complexes, military sites, bustling markets, hospitals, bridges, and the sprawling neighborhoods that made the city a living organism. But all of that would come gradually. For now, the focus was on absorbing the city's atmosphere. Understanding its rhythms, respecting its scale, and recognizing the countless lives intertwined within its limits. The city waited. And the coalition, quiet and steady, prepared to continue. Part 13. The statue falls. Baghdad's early hours on April 9, 2003 carried a kind of muted tension, an atmosphere that felt suspended between uncertainty and inevitability. For days, coalition forces had been advancing deeper into the city, moving through sprawling districts and approaching key locations. Yet despite pockets of resistance, the city seemed to loosen its grip on organized defense. Government buildings stood quiet. Broadcast stations had fallen silent. Communication nodes had gone dark. In this sleep-friendly retelling, Part 13 becomes not a moment of spectacle, but a slow, atmospheric shift in the emotional landscape of the capital. The fall of Saddam Hussein's statue in Firdos Square, an event that would become globally iconic, unfolds here as a gentle, historical turning point, observed with the calm detachment of someone watching a tide recede. A city in transition. As dawn rose over Baghdad, the sun filtered softly through a haze of dust and smoke. The city looked both familiar and strangely altered. The riverbanks shimmered. Rooftops glowed faintly. Palm trees swayed in a light breeze, dropping fronds that landed softly on old stone courtyards. Birds circled lazily above minarets. But the signs of change were everywhere. Streets once filled with patrols were now quiet. Government buildings were empty, their doors ajar. The large squares, usually hubs of gathering, traffic, and commerce, felt strangely hollow, as though the city itself were exhaling after years of tension. Residents stepped outside with caution. Some walked slowly down streets to look for news. Others huddled in doorways, speaking in low, uncertain voices. The atmosphere felt like the silence after a storm, or the stillness before rain, a collective pause as Baghdad tried to understand what was happening. Approaching Firdos Square. Coalition forces neared Firdos Square by late morning, moving quietly through broad boulevards lined with hotels, banks, and government offices. The area felt different from other parts of the city, more open, more spacious, framed by palm-lined median strips and large buildings with wide glass facades. The Palestine Hotel towered nearby, its balconies now filled with journalists who had been trapped within the building for days. Many of them watched from above, cameras ready, documenting every slow, deliberate motion of the advancing troops. Firdos Square itself was an open plaza with a centerpiece that dominated the space, a tall pedestal supporting a massive statue of Saddam Hussein. Cast in bronze or dark metal, the statue showed the Iraqi president in a confident, almost triumphant pose, one hand raised high, the figure emerging proudly from a reinforced base. For years, the statue had been a symbol of the regime's power and reach. For many residents, it represented fear, control, and the weight of authoritarian rule. Now, on this morning, the statue stood in silence. Gathering of civilians. As coalition troops secured the surrounding streets, small groups of civilians began cautiously entering the square. They approached in hesitant steps, scanning the area for danger. Some watched from behind low walls. Others moved closer, circling the pedestal at a distance. Their expressions were varied: curiosity, disbelief, relief, anxiety, and a quiet sense of expectancy. For many Iraqis, this was the moment they had wondered about for years, a moment they were not sure would ever come. Families gathered near the edges of the plaza. Older men leaned on canes, gazing upward. Children clung to their mothers' hands, whispering questions. Some young men approached more confidently, pointing up at the statue with animated gestures. A few carried small hammers or sticks, objects not meant to destroy metal, but symbolic tools of release. The energy in the square remained quiet, almost reverent. People did not shout or rush. Instead, they approached the statue gradually, the way one might approach a mountain that had dominated a horizon for as long as memory could stretch. Soldiers and civilians meet. Coalition troops did not rush the moment either. They positioned themselves calmly around the square, giving civilians space while maintaining awareness of their surroundings. The soldiers' movements were slow and steady, patrolling gently, communicating softly across radios, checking rooftops, and taking care to avoid escalating tensions. Occasional conversations took place between residents and soldiers. Some Iraqis pointed to the statue, gesturing emphatically. Others asked questions in broken English or through gestures. Soldiers, aware of the fragility of the moment, responded with patience, a nod, a wave, or a simple attempt at shared understanding. Overhead, the sky grew brighter as midday approached. Heat shimmered along the pavement. The atmosphere in the square thickened with anticipation. The first attempts at removal. A small group of Iraqi civilians began striking the statue's base with hammers and stones. Their efforts, though earnest, had little effect. The pedestal was made of heavy concrete and steel, reinforced to withstand time, weather, and resistance. The tapping of hammers echoed faintly across the plaza, sounding almost like distant chimes. A few men tied ropes around the statue's neck, pulling together in coordinated tugs. The ropes strained but held. The statue remained unmoved, looming above them with its familiar posture. These first attempts were symbolic rather than practical. But for those taking part, the symbolism mattered deeply. Each strike, each pull of the rope represented years of suppressed frustration, fear, and longing for change. A gentle intervention. Recognizing that civilians alone could not bring down the statue, coalition soldiers eventually brought a vehicle into the square, a large, powerful armored recovery vehicle with a long, sturdy crane arm. Its arrival did not disrupt the atmosphere. Rather, the machine approached with slow, careful movements, as though aware of the importance of the moment. Engineers stepped out to examine the statue's structure. Civilians gathered around, watching intently. A rope was replaced with a stronger cable, then secured around the statue's neck. The cable glinted slightly in the sunlight as tension was applied. The engine revved softly. The statue trembled. The slow toppling. When the statue began to lean, it did so with surprising slowness. The metal figure shifted gradually, its weight pulling against the cable. The pedestal creaked softly. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the soldiers paused, watching the moment unfold with quiet attention. The statue tilted farther, its shadow stretching across the square. Then, with one final pull, it broke free. The massive figure fell forward, striking the ground with a thud that echoed off the surrounding buildings. A gust of dust rose into the air, swirling in soft spirals as it drifted upward. The reaction in Firdos Square. The crowd responded not with chaotic explosions of noise, but with a subdued wave of emotion, cheers, clapping, crying, and quiet embraces shared between neighbors. Children jumped excitedly on the fallen statue. Adults touched its surface as though verifying that it was truly gone. Some people tore pieces from the pedestal. Others simply stood with tears in their eyes, staring at the fallen symbol. Many looked up at the sky, murmuring prayers of gratitude or relief. The coalition remained steady, watching respectfully. They understood the importance of this moment, not for the war's timeline, but for the emotional landscape of Iraq. The symbolism of the fall. The toppling of Saddam's statue did not signal the end of the conflict. It did not mean the country would immediately find stability. But it did mark a turning point, an unmistakable sign that the era of Saddam Hussein's rule had come to a definitive end. For Iraqis gathered in the square, the statue's fall represented possibility. A new chapter. A moment to breathe after decades of constraint. A symbol of liberation, however complex the path ahead might be. In this calming narrative, the moment becomes a quiet unveiling, a slow transition from one phase of history to another. The day fades into evening. As the sun lowered and shadows grew longer, Firdos Square settled into a peaceful stillness. The fallen statue remained where it had landed. People drifted back to their homes, speaking softly in the fading light. Soldiers repositioned their vehicles with deliberate care. Journalists filed their reports. And the Tigris, flowing not far away, carried the day's reflection across its shimmering surface. The city remained uncertain, but in this moment, it also felt lighter. Part 14. The collapse of a government. The fall of Baghdad in April 2003 was not a single event, but a gradual unraveling that touched every corner of Iraqi life. To understand the environment that followed the toppling of the statue in Firdos Square, one must imagine a city suspended between the remnants of an old order and the uncertain promise of something new. This chapter in our quiet, sleep-friendly retelling focuses not on the noise and turmoil sometimes associated with wartime change, but on the atmospheric stillness that often accompanies a power vacuum. It is the story of what happens in the hours and days after a government collapses. It is a moment when silence can feel louder than sound, and when the absence of authority shapes the rhythm of life. Let us drift now into that stillness. A city without bearings. In the earliest hours following the symbolic fall of Saddam Hussein's statue, Baghdad felt like a place caught between breaths. The desert heat pressed lightly upon the city, and the ever-present scent of dust drifted through open streets. palm fronds rustled softly overhead. The Tigris flowed steadily, glinting in the sunlight as though indifferent to the changes taking place along its banks. But beneath this seemingly calm exterior lay a profound transformation. The institutions that once controlled daily life, ministries, security forces, local administrative offices, had suddenly vanished or become inert. Buildings once bustling with workers now stood empty. Streets previously patrolled by police or intelligence units were now unmonitored. Government officials who had occupied powerful positions for years had fled, gone into hiding, or simply disappeared. For residents, the feeling was surreal. They stepped outside their homes and discovered that the symbols of authority were simply gone. No traffic officers. No state television broadcasts. No party officials organizing meetings. No representatives enforcing old laws. The rhythm of familiar oversight had disappeared overnight. It was as if an invisible web that had held the city together had quietly dissolved. The sound of emptiness. What many remembered most vividly from these days was not the sound of battle but the unsettling quiet that came afterward. Baghdad is a city that usually hums, markets, cars, vendors calling out, children playing, the occasional distant music floating in from a wedding or celebration. But in the days following the collapse, the soundscape shifted dramatically. People walked with careful steps. Doors opened only a few inches at a time. Conversations were spoken in low tones, as though people were still adjusting to the idea that no one was listening for dissent. The absence of controlling forces should have brought a feeling of liberation, and for some it did. But the transition from structure to emptiness can be unsettling. Even the wind seems louder when there are no competing sounds. The ministries stand silent. In a sleep-friendly imagining, we stroll slowly past the Iraqi Ministry of Information, its once intimidating facade now quiet. Papers that had once been guarded with intense secrecy lie scattered across the floor. Telephones hang from their cords, receivers removed during the rush to flee. Metal desks sit half open, drawers empty or filled with abandoned documents. The Ministry of Interior looks much the same. Offices show signs of abrupt departure. Many workers did not take time to gather their belongings, they left quickly, quietly, unsure of what would come next. Some buildings show signs of smoke from small fires or the burning of records. What is most striking is the stillness. These places had once been centers of immense power. Now, sunlight streams through shattered windows onto silent hallways, creating a strange tranquility where fear once lived. A leadership vacuum. Without a government in place, the city became a patchwork of self-governed zones. Neighborhoods organized themselves according to long-standing familial or tribal systems. Local leaders stepped forward to mediate disputes, direct local watch groups, or organize community support. In some areas, people took turns guarding streets to prevent vandalism or protect shops. In others, informal committees met to decide how to distribute scarce goods like water or medicine. The absence of centralized authority made ordinary citizens the temporary stewards of their own communities. And although this came with challenges, it also revealed a deep resilience, an ability to adapt and survive even in the face of sweeping uncertainty. The question of security. One of the most difficult aspects of the government's collapse involved the widespread looting that occurred in parts of Baghdad. But in this sleep-focused retelling, we focus not on the chaos itself, but on the sensation of disorientation that arises when a city suddenly loses its guiding institutions. Imagine walking down a street where familiar stores stand open, their doors swinging in the breeze because no one is left to lock them. Shelves sit half empty, not only from looters but because shop owners fled in fear. Streets are littered with debris. Traffic lights blink pointlessly at intersections with no cars. Coalition forces, though present, were stretched thin. Many units focused on securing strategic points such as government complexes, bridges, or known military sites. Patrols moved slowly, assessing needs and uncertain where to focus first. The city felt simultaneously watched and unwatched, a contradiction that added to the surreal nature of the days that followed. Residents adjust to the new reality. For most families, the collapse of the government prompted a return to basic routines grounded in caution. Parents urged children to remain indoors. Neighbors checked on one another, sharing news gathered by word of mouth. People visited markets in small groups, quickly buying staples when available: bread, rice, dates, tea, small bags of flour. In quieter moments, people sat on rugs inside their homes, drinking tea in the dim afternoon light. Conversation shifted between fear, hope, disbelief, and pragmatic planning. Was the war over? Who would lead next? Would electricity return soon? Would water become difficult to find? Would the schools reopen? Would the city stabilize? These conversations mirrored those in thousands of homes across the country. The absence of answers meant the imagination filled the empty spaces, often with scenarios that ranged from optimistic to troubling. The coalition takes the first steps. As Baghdad adjusted to the collapse, coalition forces worked to stabilize the city. Units established checkpoints, organized limited patrols, and made contact with local residents to understand urgent needs. In many places, soldiers helped distribute bottled water or medical supplies. Commanders met with civil affairs teams, reconstruction experts, engineers, and translators to plan how to restore essential services. The earliest goals were simple: restore basic security, ensure access to water, protect hospitals, and begin re-establishing a sense of order. But in the vastness of Baghdad, even small tasks felt monumental. The coalition's governance plan would arrive soon, and with it, new administrative structures. But in Part 14, we remain in these early transitional days, before such structures were fully put into place. The emotional landscape of a fallen regime. Perhaps the most intangible yet profound effect of the government's collapse was the shift in mood across Baghdad. People felt relief mingled with fear, curiosity intertwined with grief, hope shadowed by skepticism. Everyone knew that life had changed forever, but no one knew whether it would change for the better or worse. In this sleep-friendly interpretation, we focus on the quiet moments. Families lighting small lamps in the evening, neighbors sharing plates of food, distant prayers rising softly from neighborhood mosques as dusk settled over the city. The emotional weight of the moment hung in the air like the dust that drifted lazily through sunbeams. It was heavy, but it also carried with it potential, a sense that a door had opened, even if the path beyond it remained hazy. Night falls on a leaderless city. As Part 14 comes to a close, imagine Baghdad at night. The city rests under a wide, star-filled sky, free from the usual glow of streetlights because much of the power grid remains off. Houses are lit by candles or small oil lamps. The wind carries the scent of warm sand across rooftops. Dogs bark occasionally in the distance. A lone car drives slowly down a street, its headlights cutting through the dusk. It is a city without a government, without structure, without clarity. Yet it is also a city that endures. Baghdad has survived conquest, siege, empire, famine, and rebirth across thousands of years. And now, once again, it enters a new chapter. Part 15. The struggle to restore order. In the days and weeks following the collapse of Saddam Hussein's government, Baghdad occupied a strange liminal space between the absence of old structures and the emergence of new ones. If Part 14 captured the moment of dissolution, this chapter explores the next phase, the slow, uneven, and often fragile attempts to restore order in a city that had slipped out of the grasp of any formal authority. This is a quiet chapter, one that follows the subtle rhythms of reconstruction rather than the noise of conflict. In our sleep-friendly retelling, we drift gently through the neighborhoods, corridors, and dusty streets where early efforts to stabilize life unfolded. Not everything was resolved quickly. Much remained uncertain. Yet these days laid the groundwork for what came after. Let us move through this moment with calm steps. A city in need of structure. When a government collapses, its absence is felt not only in grand political terms but in the small daily rituals that make a city livable. Suddenly, Baghdad lacked basic administrative functions. Schools had no direction. Hospitals operated without steady supply chains. Water and electricity flowed irregularly. Traffic became chaotic. Ministries that once managed everything from sewage to identity records now sat empty and silent. The coalition forces who had entered Baghdad were prepared for combat operations, but not for the breadth of civil tasks that awaited them. Even something as simple as street repair or trash removal required coordination that did not yet exist. In this delicate atmosphere, the first struggle to restore order emerged not as a sweeping single effort, but as countless small attempts made day after day, hour after hour. Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA, takes shape. To fill the void left by the fallen government, the coalition established what became known as the Coalition Provisional Authority. In reality, its initial presence was slow to take form. Offices had to be set up, advisors assembled, interpreters hired, and communication channels created. The earliest days of the CPA felt like the sketch of an administration rather than a completed design. It existed first as a collection of individuals scattered across the city, some working out of temporary trailers, others occupying former government buildings now stripped of furniture or damaged by weeks of fighting. Gradually, the organization solidified. Policies were drafted. Meetings were held with community representatives. Plans were proposed for infrastructure restoration, reconstruction funding, and security training. But like all large endeavors, progress was uneven. Some initiatives advanced quickly. Others stalled. Still others provoked controversy, uncertainty, or confusion among the people they aimed to help. The CPA was tasked with rebuilding a state from the dust of what had collapsed. It was an extraordinary undertaking, and the complexities of Iraq's political and social landscape made every decision delicate. Security forces disbanded. One of the most impactful decisions in the early reconstruction period was the dissolution of Iraq's military and security forces. In theory, it meant removing the remnants of Saddam's regime to allow for a fresh start. In practice, however, it created an enormous vacuum. Hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers, police officers, and intelligence personnel suddenly found themselves without employment, direction, or purpose. Many returned to their homes, unsure of how they would support their families. Others drifted across the country in search of new opportunities. A significant number joined emerging insurgent groups, driven by anger, fear, or disillusionment. In the quiet of a nighttime Baghdad, one could sense the tension this decision introduced. The hum of uncertainty lingered above neighborhoods. People whispered about the consequences at evening tea gatherings. The decision reshaped the future in ways no one fully anticipated at the time. Efforts to restore basic services. Amid the political shifts, practical needs remained urgent. Baghdad required functioning infrastructure in order to survive the transition. The water treatment plants that served millions needed immediate repairs. Electrical grids, damaged by both conflict and years of strain, flickered unpredictably. Garbage accumulated in alleys. Sewage systems overflowed in several districts. Coalition engineers worked side by side with Iraqi technicians to identify what could be fixed quickly. Turning on the lights in even one neighborhood required coordination across multiple ministries that no longer existed. And yet, little by little, small improvements were made. A water pump restored here. A transformer repaired there. Fuel trucks redirected toward hospitals instead of abandoned checkpoints. Residents who had spent days or weeks without electricity would cheer quietly when their homes flickered back to life. Some families clapped. Others recited brief prayers of thanks. And in the distance, across the Tigris, small islands of illumination appeared, like fireflies returning to a field long left dark. Neighborhood watch groups. In many parts of Baghdad, order in the early days was maintained not by formal institutions but by neighborhood cooperation. Groups of men formed informal watch rotations, carrying flashlights or sticks, patrolling a few blocks each night to deter theft or vandalism. These groups emerged organically. Some were led by respected elders. Others by younger men who moved with a sense of responsibility. Women contributed by organizing food, tending to children, or sharing information gathered through family networks. These watch groups became a symbol of community resilience. In the absence of a police force, Baghdad's residents, drawing on centuries-old traditions, stepped forward to protect their homes with a quiet dignity. Their footsteps in the evening dust became the heartbeat of neighborhoods struggling to re-establish normalcy. The return of market life. Markets often reveal the real condition of a city. In the weeks after the fall of the government, Baghdad's markets reopened in a tentative, cautious way. Vendors set up small tables in front of their shops or spread blankets on the ground. Goods were modest at first: dates, tea, bread, rice, cigarettes, small household items. Slowly, vegetables returned. Meat sellers arrived next. Clothing merchants appeared soon after. There was a soft murmur of life in these markets, voices speaking quietly, hands exchanging coins, the sound of woven baskets rustling. These markets allowed families to feel connected to normal life again. They also gave coalition forces and aid groups a way to observe local needs and concerns. In the warm glow of late afternoon, with the sun stretching across rooftops, the markets were a reminder that even during upheaval, daily life continues. People still need to eat, to barter, to gather, to maintain routines that anchor them to a sense of stability. Beginnings of a new political order. Around the same time, discussions quietly began about the future of Iraq's political system. Leaders from various ethnic, tribal, and religious groups met with the CPA and with one another. New councils formed. Proposals were considered for elections, constitutional reforms, and transitional legal structures. These early conversations were sometimes hopeful, sometimes tense. They hinted at the diversity and complexity of Iraqi society. Kurds, Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, Turkmen, Christians, Yazidis, tribal leaders, and urban intellectuals each held differing visions for the country's future. Yet even amidst disagreements, there was a sense of possibility. In the quiet evening hours, when tea boiled over charcoal stoves and the warm glow of lamps filled living rooms, families would talk about what a new Iraq might look like. Would there be more freedoms? More opportunities? More stability? Or would tensions rise? The questions lingered without answers, but hope remained part of the conversation. A city caught between eras. As part 15 ends, imagine Baghdad at dusk, suspended between what had been lost and what had not yet been built. The call to prayer floats through the fading light. Silhouettes of palm trees sway gently along the riverbanks. Coalition patrols move slowly down wide boulevards while small groups of neighbors gather in circles to discuss the news of the day. Order has not yet returned. But the first seeds of structure, fragile, uncertain, yet present, have begun to take root. Part 16. The Rise of Insurgency. By the time spring edged into summer, Baghdad had settled into a rhythm that was neither peaceful nor fully chaotic. It was something in between, a twilight space where rebuilding efforts coexisted with growing tension. In this part of our journey, we enter that shadowed threshold where frustrations, grievances, and power vacuums began to take shape in a more organized, and more dangerous, form, the rise of insurgency. For our sleep-friendly telling, we will explore not the sharp violence itself, but the quiet undercurrents, the slow coalescing of forces, and the soft, subtle signs of how unrest grew from scattered embers into something far more coordinated. We approach this moment gently, as one would walk through a dimly lit courtyard at dusk, noticing the air shift but not rushing through it. The story of the insurgency is not told through the lens of battle, but through the slow changes in mood, in sound, in rumor, and in the atmosphere of a country struggling to understand its own future. Unsettled streets, unanswered questions. The collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime left Iraq without a central authority that could command nationwide loyalty. No single narrative guided the people. Mixed emotions shaped daily life. Some felt hopeful about the prospect of new freedoms. Others felt humiliated by the occupation. Some feared instability. Others believed they were witnessing an opportunity to reshape their country. In such an environment, even quiet streets carried tension. A shopkeeper sweeping dust from his doorstep might pause when he hears distant shouting. Families shared meals while quietly wondering who would now be in charge. Academic debates, political arguments, and old grievances resurfaced in living rooms lit by small battery lamps. There was an unspoken understanding that something was stirring beneath the surface, though no one yet knew what form it would take. For many Iraqis, life was a blend of practical concerns, finding clean water, reliable electricity, safe routes to work, and deeper existential ones. What would Iraq become? Who would benefit? Who would lose? In the calm of evening, as people sat on rooftops to escape the warmth of their homes, these questions slipped into almost every conversation. Disbandment and disillusionment. The dissolution of the Iraqi military and security forces, touched upon in Part 15, had consequences that grew clearer with each passing week. While intended to break the power of the old regime, the decision created a large population of unemployed, trained men who suddenly had no role, no income, and no sense of belonging. Imagine the quiet frustration of a former officer sitting at home, his uniform folded away, listening to distant car horns in a city struggling to redefine itself. He may have served under a system he did not fully support, but it was the system he knew. Now, he waited. Uncertain, simmering, pondering what future awaited him. Some former soldiers attempted to find new work. Others traveled to their home villages, unsure of what to do next. Many felt anger. Others felt abandoned. These emotions collected like heavy summer clouds, not yet a storm, but full of potential energy. Emergence of small resistance cells. The first stirrings of insurgency did not appear as organized armies or sweeping movements. They formed quietly, in discreet conversations. In whispered meetings behind shuttered storefronts. In small living rooms with curtains drawn tight. Groups of men sat cross-legged on worn carpets, sharing grievances, discussing news, speaking in guarded tones. These early cells were small. Some consisted of former soldiers seeking to reclaim dignity. Others were driven by religious or political ideology. Some simply wanted foreign forces to leave. Their motivations varied widely, but their anxiety about Iraq's direction united them. The language of these meetings was not loud or dramatic. It was slow, cautious, deliberate, like planners sketching shapes into soft sand. The idea of resistance formed gradually, almost tentatively, and within a few weeks, spread from neighborhood to neighborhood. The growing influence of external actors. As power vacuums deepened, external actors saw opportunity. The borders of Iraq were porous in the early months after the invasion. Foreign fighters, ideologues, and opportunists traveled into the country, sometimes through remote desert crossings, sometimes through cities where oversight was minimal. Their presence added new complexity to the local unrest. Some brought rigid ideological frameworks. Others brought funding or training. Still others came to fight for causes rooted far outside Iraq's own history. Their arrival complicated what had been a largely local set of grievances. To everyday Iraqis, the presence of outsiders was felt in subtle ways. Rumors spread of unfamiliar dialects heard in certain districts, of new faces in mosques, of unusual patterns in local gatherings. People lowered their voices when discussing politics in public. Trust became harder to establish. The social fabric, already strained, stretched a little thinner. Improvised explosive devices, IEDs. One of the earliest symbols of the rising insurgency was the appearance of IEDs. These devices did not emerge all at once. They began as small, crude constructions placed along roadsides where coalition convoys passed. To civilians, the presence of IEDs was not always visible. But the effects were noticeable: sudden road closures, changes in patrol routes, a new cautiousness in the movements of coalition forces. The streets grew slightly more tense, the air carrying a faint static of suspicion. Drivers learned to avoid certain roads at dawn. Markets stirred with whispered accounts of explosions that woke entire neighborhoods before sunrise. Even when a night passed quietly, the possibility lingered in the silence. The insurgency was taking root, not through grand gestures, but through these incremental shifts in daily life. Clashes of narratives. As unrest grew, Iraq became a place of competing stories. The coalition framed its mission as one of rebuilding. Many Iraqis saw promise in that. Others viewed the occupation as an affront to national dignity. Still others were caught between multiple perspectives, unsure which one echoed their own. Mosques played a powerful role in shaping opinion. Friday sermons became moments of reflection, debate, and sometimes fiery rhetoric. In some districts, clerics emphasized unity, patience, and cooperation. In others, they called for resistance. A single city block could contain multiple perspectives, each deeply held. In the evenings, families gathered around small televisions powered by generators. News broadcasts flickered across screens in Arabic and English, offering different portrayals of the same events. People discussed these images in thoughtful murmurs, trying to piece together what was truly happening in their own country. The atmosphere of suspicion. By mid-year, Baghdad had acquired a subtle new texture, a low-humming sense of suspicion. Cars idled more carefully at intersections. People hesitated before speaking openly in public. Market conversations shifted quickly when unfamiliar individuals approached. Foreigners, journalists, aid workers, soldiers, contractors, became both a curiosity and a source of caution. Residents watched them pass from behind shop counters or shaded doorways, unsure whether their presence brought protection or attention. This atmosphere did not yet dominate daily life, but it wove itself quietly into the city's fabric like threads of darker color in a tapestry. Neighborhoods divided by experience. Different districts experienced the rise of insurgency in different ways. Some remained relatively calm, their residents determined to maintain normal life. Others became centers of resistance activity. In some places, tribal leaders attempted to mediate tensions. In others, they joined the opposition or withdrew to avoid danger. The fragmentation of experience began to reshape Baghdad. A family living in one neighborhood might feel cautiously optimistic, while another across the river lived in constant fear. The city became a mosaic of differing realities existing side by side, like lanterns glowing at different intensities along a darkened street. The shifting role of the coalition. Coalition forces, observing these changes, adapted their strategies. Patrols became more frequent but also more cautious. Officers met with local leaders more regularly. Conversations took place in schools, mosques, municipal buildings, or sometimes in humble homes where elders served tea while discussing security concerns. This period required a balance between enforcement and diplomacy. Neither approach alone was sufficient. Soldiers walked a delicate line between maintaining safety and avoiding escalation. Their presence was steady but increasingly met with ambivalence by the population. In the stillness of early mornings, when soldiers assembled before patrols and Baghdad hummed with generator-powered lights, the sense of uncertainty was palpable. The old conflicts had ended, but new ones were beginning to bloom. The insurgency becomes visible. By the close of this chapter, the insurgency had shifted from faint murmurs to tangible signs. Bombings were no longer anomalies. Recruitment increased. Leaflets appeared. Anonymous messages spread. The tone of public discourse grew sharper. Yet amid all this, everyday life continued. Children played in alleys. Markets bustled. Weddings were held. People adapted, as humans always do, to the shifting tides around them. The rise of insurgency marked a turning point. It signaled that Iraq's challenges were no longer simply those of rebuilding, but of navigating a conflict within a conflict. A layered struggle, born in the shadows of deeper historical complexities. It is in this duality, this mixture of ordinary routines and extraordinary tensions, that Part 16 gently closes. Part 17. The Battle for Hearts and Minds. As the insurgency intensified, the conflict in Iraq entered a new phase, one defined less by territory and more by influence. The struggle now unfolded across neighborhoods, mosques, homes, and the fragile bonds of a society trying to rediscover itself. The phrase that circulated among coalition planners was winning hearts and minds, but what that meant in the day-to-day rhythm of Iraqi life was far more complicated and subtle. In this chapter, we move quietly through the streets, listening to the voices of families, elders, local leaders, and soldiers. The war at this stage was as much psychological as physical, shaped by trust, perception, and the small but powerful gestures exchanged between strangers who now lived in the same uncertain space. Our story remains gentle, sleep-oriented, and reflective, focusing on the emotional climate rather than the violence. Daily life amid uncertainty. By late 2003 and into early 2004, many Iraqis found themselves caught between competing powers. On the one hand, coalition forces patrolled the streets, attempting to keep order and respond to threats. On the other, insurgent groups operated in the shadows, offering their own version of protection, often through intimidation or persuasion. The average person simply wanted stability. Someone waking before dawn to knead dough for morning bread was not thinking of geopolitics. A teacher preparing her lessons by candlelight during an electricity outage cared more about her students' safety than the broader strategies of warring factions. Families sweeping courtyards, repairing shutters, or seeking medicine at market stalls were more concerned with survival than ideology. In these small details of life, one could feel the pulse of the country. It beat irregularly, sometimes strong, sometimes faint, but always insisting on the simple human desire for normalcy. The coalition's community projects. To gain trust, coalition forces launched initiatives intended to improve daily living conditions. Schools were repainted and reopened. Water treatment projects were funded. Hospitals received new supplies. Roads were repaired. Electricity grids were patched, if only temporarily. Posters announced investment in infrastructure, and local councils formed to manage small budgets. These projects varied in effectiveness. In some districts, they created goodwill. Children waved at passing patrols. Merchants offered tea to soldiers overseeing construction teams. Community leaders attended meetings with cautious optimism. In other areas, the efforts were met with suspicion. Rumors spread that projects served hidden agendas. Some believed improvements were too slow. Others felt promises were too often broken. A new well or generator might bring hope for a week, then fade into disappointment when fuel ran short or repairs were neglected. Still, each visible improvement, fresh paint on school walls, a working streetlight flickering to life after dark, offered brief glimmers of progress. These glimmers mattered, even if they did not last. Insurgent messaging and influence. While coalition forces used reconstruction as a means of outreach, insurgent groups used narrative. Leaflets appeared on doorsteps before dawn. They warned families not to cooperate with foreigners. They framed resistance as patriotic and moral. In some areas, insurgent representatives quietly visited homes, speaking in calm tones about honor, faith, or nationalism. Their influence was often built on a simple truth: they understood local culture, language, and history better than the occupying forces. In certain districts, insurgents provided small services. They mediated disputes, distributed food, or offered protection in exchange for loyalty. These actions, however limited, allowed them to compete for legitimacy. For many Iraqis, this created a painful dilemma. Supporting the coalition meant hoping for long-term benefits. Supporting insurgents meant immediate safety or social acceptance. The moral landscape was blurred by fear, fatigue, and practical necessity. Cultural misunderstandings. Even among those who wished to cooperate with coalition forces, communication challenges were common. Different worlds collided in marketplaces, checkpoints, and community spaces. American and British soldiers often struggled to interpret hand gestures, facial expressions, or tones of voice that carried subtle cultural meanings. Iraqis sometimes misunderstood the intentions behind certain military procedures. Small misinterpretations accumulated like grains of sand, gradually shaping the relationship between occupiers and the occupied. There were moments of connection, shared smiles, humorous exchanges with children, respectful conversations with elders. But these moments existed alongside awkwardness, frustration, and the awkward weight of cultural distance. Emotional bridges could be built, but they were fragile, like footpaths of woven reed stretching over uncertain ground. The role of religious leaders. In Iraq, religious leaders were among the most influential voices in society. Their sermons shaped public opinion far more powerfully than any pamphlet or speech by a foreign official. Some imams urged patience, peace, and cooperation. They reminded their congregations that rebuilding was a long process. Others, however, delivered fiery messages against the occupation. Their words stirred anger, pride, or defiance, depending on their audience. Friday prayers became not just moments of worship, but emotional litmus tests for communities. A sermon delivered in a large mosque could influence thousands of families by nightfall. In this climate, coalition forces sought alliances with moderate religious leaders. These relationships were delicate. A single misstep in protocol, improper greeting etiquette, an unintended slight, or a rushed meeting could damage weeks of progress. Still, partnerships formed. Elders and officers shared tea in modest rooms, seated on mismatched cushions, discussing the future with quiet seriousness. These discussions sometimes produced meaningful cooperation. Other times, they dissolved into cautious politeness. Media and the battle of perception. Television, radio, and newspapers became central battlegrounds. Stations reported on attacks, arrests, political debates, and community developments. Each outlet framed events differently. Some media portrayed insurgents as protectors of cultural dignity. Others depicted them as destabilizing forces harming innocent civilians. Coalition representatives attempted to reach the population through interviews and press briefings, though these sometimes felt distant or unconvincing to locals. At home, Iraqis watched flickering screens powered by generators, listening as anchors debated policies or tragedies. In the quiet glow of television light, families formed opinions that influenced their willingness to support new institutions or reject them entirely. Trust as a scarce resource. Perhaps the most significant challenge of this chapter in the conflict was the scarcity of trust. Trust in government was low after decades of authoritarian rule. Trust in the coalition was fragile and easily shaken. Trust within communities was strained by conflicting loyalties. Even trust among family members could be complicated by political disagreements. Trust is a slow-growing plant. It cannot be forced. It thrives in stability but withers under fear. And during this period, fear touched almost every home in some way. Still, there were moments where trust blossomed briefly. A successful local project. A helpful interaction at a checkpoint. A respectful conversation between soldiers and shopkeepers. These moments mattered more than statistics could measure. They formed the emotional fabric beneath the conflict. Hearts and minds in the balance. By mid-2004, it was clear that the coalition's success depended not just on military strength but on public sentiment. Every road paved, every school repaired, every meeting held mattered. But so did every misstep, every misunderstanding, every instance of delayed assistance or perceived disrespect. The insurgency understood this. Their strategy centered on undermining trust in the occupation. They sought to disrupt community projects, intimidate collaborators, and paint coalition forces as unreliable. They targeted hope itself. The coalition, meanwhile, tried to build hope. Their efforts were genuine in many cases but hampered by limited resources, bureaucratic delays, and the fundamental challenge of operating in an unfamiliar society under constant threat. And so the struggle for hearts and minds was not a simple competition. It was a delicate, shifting landscape shaped by human fears, dreams, and memories. The quiet turning point. Toward the end of this period, the insurgency's influence reached a point where it could no longer be ignored or dismissed. Attacks increased, threats spread, and the psychological weight on the population intensified. People felt the strain in subtle ways, whispered conversations, cautious glances, quieter markets after sunset. Even hope, which had once been bright in the earliest weeks after liberation, now flickered like a candle struggling against a draft. Still, hope did not vanish. Some neighborhoods remained resilient. Some leaders continued advocating for unity. Families supported one another. Teachers kept teaching. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Life persisted, carrying a soft determination that outlasted fear. This period, though clouded by uncertainty, laid the groundwork for the political changes to come: elections, constitutional debates, new leadership, and shifting power structures. But before those changes arrived, Iraq would face an even more volatile phase. Part 18. The formation of a new Iraqi government. By the time the year turned toward its middle months, the conflict in Iraq had entered another delicate transition. The insurgency continued to grow in the shadows, yet parallel to that rising threat, a slow and fragile political transformation was taking shape. After decades of authoritarian rule, Iraq faced the daunting challenge of forming a new government. One meant to represent its people, its regions, its histories, and its profound diversity. This chapter takes a soft, lingering look at how that process unfolded, not through dramatic confrontations or political upheaval, but through the steady, careful efforts of individuals sitting in meeting halls, community centers, private homes, and temporary offices set up in dusty compounds. Our goal is to explore this transformative period the way a person might wander through a quiet archive at dusk, observing the unfolding of a nation's future as if leafing through pages worn by many hands. The creation of a new government in Iraq was not a single event. It was a tapestry woven thread by thread, committees formed, debates held, drafts reviewed, and voices raised in both hope and apprehension. The process was uneven and sometimes frustrating. But it also carried profound importance, for in these long conversations lay the blueprint for Iraq's road ahead. The transfer of authority. One of the most symbolic developments during this period was the plan to transfer authority from the Coalition Provisional Authority, the temporary governing body, to an interim Iraqi government. The idea was to restore a sense of ownership, giving Iraqis responsibility for managing their political transition. This effort required careful coordination. Coalition officials held lengthy meetings to determine which powers could be transferred, when, and under what protections. Iraqi leaders, many newly returned from exile or emerging from political dormancy, attended conferences that stretched late into the night. Translators moved quietly between groups, ensuring every word was understood. For ordinary people, the news of an upcoming transfer of authority brought a faint sense of renewed possibility. Radio broadcasts discussed it each morning. Men sipping tea in roadside cafes debated whether the interim government would be effective. Women gathering water or shopping in markets spoke about it in soft, thoughtful tones. Everyone understood the importance of the moment, even if they doubted how smoothly the transition would unfold. It was an atmosphere filled with contemplation rather than celebration. People were hopeful, but gently so, as if protecting themselves from disappointment. Choosing leaders amid uncertainty. Selecting individuals to serve in the interim government was a complex undertaking. Iraq was a country of many identities: Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, Turkmen, Christian, and others. Each group had its own history, grievances, and aspirations. To build legitimacy, the new government needed to reflect this diversity. Committees convened in large conference rooms, their tables covered in stacks of papers, handwritten notes, and small cups of strong tea. Names were discussed. Some known for political activism, others for intellectual contributions, still others for tribal leadership or religious influence. There were debates about representation, qualifications, and the careful balance required to avoid inflaming old regional or sectarian tensions. Some meetings were tense. Others were unexpectedly warm, with participants sharing stories of their childhoods, their families, or their memories of Iraq before conflict fractured its unity. These gentle moments created small bridges in rooms that might have otherwise felt divided. The selection process was slow, deliberate, and at times uneven. But it unfolded with a steady sincerity. Everyone involved understood the gravity of shaping a government that would guide Iraq through its most vulnerable years. The interim constitution. Drafting an interim constitution, officially called the Transitional Administrative Law, was another major step. This temporary framework would guide Iraq's governance until national elections could be held. Legal scholars, political advisors, and Iraqi representatives spent long hours examining constitutional models from other countries. They debated the role of religion in the state, the balance between federal and regional authority, the rights of minorities, and the structure of the future parliament. Like many monumental tasks, the drafting process was filled with quiet moments. Someone gently tapping a pen while thinking, another flipping through a thick binder of comparative constitutional texts, an advisor leaning forward to softly explain a clause to a colleague, a translator reading aloud in slow, even rhythm. Outside the meeting rooms, journalists gathered in shaded outdoor corridors, waiting for updates. Citizens listened to briefings on local radio stations, their conversations the next morning reflecting cautious curiosity. Despite disagreements, the interim constitution gradually took form. In the early hours of dawn, after long nights of work, some drafters would step outside to breathe the cool air and gather strength before returning to negotiations. The process was tiring, yet profoundly hopeful, a quiet act of imagining a different future. Local councils and community voices. While national institutions were being rebuilt, local councils also took shape in towns and cities throughout the country. These councils allowed communities to express concerns, propose local initiatives, and work with coalition officers on practical matters: school repairs, electricity distribution, neighborhood security, and water access. Meetings often took place in modest rooms with plastic chairs, whiteboards, and faded carpets. Men and women from the community gathered, some nervous, others eager. Their voices represented the lived experience of ordinary Iraqis in a way national leaders sometimes struggle to capture. In some districts, the councils functioned smoothly. In others, they encountered distrust or factional divisions. But even in the most difficult cases, the simple act of gathering, of sitting side by side to discuss shared problems, was itself a quiet sign of resilience. These councils planted early seeds of democratic participation, even if they sprouted unevenly. International involvement. Throughout the transition period, the United Nations played an advisory role. UN envoys met with Iraqi leaders, coalition officials, and local groups. Their presence gave some Iraqis a sense of reassurance that the process was not solely directed by outside military powers. Diplomatic missions from various countries visited Baghdad, offering technical expertise in governance, elections, and economic development. In heavily guarded compounds, representatives from different nations walked through shaded courtyards between meeting halls, carrying folders of documents and handwritten notes. Their work was not always visible to the public, but it contributed to the gradual formation of Iraq's new institutions. Public reaction, a blend of hope and worry. For ordinary Iraqis, the formation of the interim government meant many things at once. For some, it was an opportunity. A chance to reclaim their nation's future and participate in political life for the first time. For others, it was a source of skepticism. They wondered whether the new leaders truly represented them or whether the process was shaped too strongly by external influence. In the evenings, discussions echoed through living rooms. Families sat together on cushions or worn sofas, small lamps illuminating their conversations. Some expressed excitement about elections. Others shared stories of hardship, lost relatives, difficulties finding work, unreliable electricity that made them question whether political change could address their daily challenges. But even among the skeptics, a quiet strand of hope remained. The idea of self-governance, after so many years of authoritarian rule, had a certain power. Security and governance intertwined. One of the most delicate realities of this period was the interplay between political progress and security. Every step toward forming a government took place under the pressure of increasing insurgent activity. Attacks sought not just to harm, but to undermine confidence in the political transition. This meant that political leaders worked under constant stress. Meetings were held in fortified compounds. Travel required security convoys. The mood was determined yet wary. Still, the work continued. Documents were drafted, debated, revised, and rewritten. Leaders met with citizens, journalists, and international advisors. Press conferences announced progress, even when that progress was slow. Through it all, the idea of a new Iraq, shaped by its own people, remained the guiding light. The swearing-in of the interim government. When the interim government was finally sworn in, the ceremony, though modest and secured by layers of protection, held genuine meaning. It signaled a shift from occupation to Iraqi self-administration, even if still under heavy coalition oversight. Photographs of the new leaders circulated. Their names were repeated in coffee shops, classrooms, and markets. A symbolic weight settled in the air. Iraqis now had figures who spoke on their behalf, who represented their nation to the world, and who would bear responsibility for shaping its future. This moment did not end the conflict. But it marked a milestone. A step toward sovereignty, however fragile. A country moving forward, one careful step at a time. As this chapter closes, Iraq stood poised between possibility and uncertainty. The interim government had been formed. The transition of authority had taken place. The political process had begun. Yet the challenges ahead remained vast: the insurgency, economic hardship, infrastructure failures, and the long process of writing a permanent constitution. Still, in the midst of it all, something new had been born, a government built not by decree, but through collective dialogue, negotiation, and the shared hope of a better future. It was an imperfect beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. Part 19. First national elections and the long road to stability. By the time Iraq approached its first national elections, the atmosphere across the country felt like a mixture of tension, uncertainty, and the faintest shimmer of possibility. The months leading up to this moment had been filled with meetings, negotiations, security challenges, and an ongoing struggle to define Iraq's future after decades of authoritarian rule. While the insurgency continued to cast long shadows, a parallel narrative was quietly emerging, the story of Iraqis preparing, often cautiously, to reclaim political agency. In this chapter, we walk through that delicate period, the build-up to the elections, the emotions that accompanied them, and the early aftermath. We take our time, drifting slowly through meetings halls, quiet neighborhoods, and the guarded optimism that flickered to life in living rooms across the country. Everything remains gentle and sleep-oriented, focusing on the ideas, the emotions, and the symbolic significance of the election rather than the conflict. The experience of the first national elections was something like watching dawn break over a troubled landscape. The darkness did not disappear, but the light began to soften it. The preparation phase, infrastructure for democracy. Organizing elections in a country still adjusting to occupation, insurgency, and political change was a monumental undertaking. It required a vast network of workers, volunteers, international advisors, and local leaders. Temporary offices were established in school buildings, municipal halls, and even in some private homes repurposed as registration centers. Ballot boxes were manufactured or imported. Lists of polling stations were printed and circulated. Voter rolls had to be created in a nation where record-keeping had been inconsistent for years. Posters explaining the voting process appeared on walls and bulletin boards. Radio announcers described the steps in slow, clear Arabic so that people could understand exactly how the system would work. In many districts, election officials conducted informational sessions in quiet rooms lit by lanterns or small generators. Curious residents sat in rows of folding chairs, listening as facilitators explained how ballots were cast, how they would be counted, and how representatives would be allocated. Even these sessions had a solemn, almost reverent quality. For many Iraqis, it was the first time they had heard such instruction spoken in earnest. Their country had not held a true competitive election in decades. Every piece of paperwork, every conversation, every distributed ballot felt like a small affirmation that something new was taking shape. Cautious optimism in households. Inside Iraqi homes, the weeks leading up to the election sparked long discussions. Families sat on cushions or simple wooden chairs, tea steaming in small glasses, while fathers, mothers, and elders debated the significance of the coming vote. Some expressed hope. Others expressed fear. A few doubted whether their participation would matter. But even those who questioned the process felt the gravity of the moment. The idea of choosing leaders, not having them imposed, was powerful. A grandmother might tell her grandchildren stories of life before decades of political repression. A father might sit silently for a long time before offering a quiet opinion about what kind of leader Iraq now needed. A young adult, born after many of the country's older conflicts, might feel a mixture of confusion and pride at the idea of voting. Political identity was not yet fully shaped in Iraq. Many citizens were unsure which parties truly represented them. What mattered more was the symbolism, the act of voting itself. Posters, parties, and platforms. Political parties, newly formed or newly resurfaced after years of suppression, rushed to organize. Their posters appeared on every available surface. On concrete walls, on metal gates, on the sides of shops. Some posters showed serious faces framed by bold slogans. Others emphasized unity, religion, or national pride. Not everyone understood the platforms of these parties. The sheer number was overwhelming. Tribes, sects, regions, ideologies, and coalitions all provided options. First-time voters found themselves studying posters with the hopeful confusion of someone browsing a new library without a guide. And yet, the uncertainty created its own kind of peaceful introspection. People asked one another questions. They exchanged rumors. They debated gently, or sometimes intensely, but always with the understanding that a profound national responsibility rested upon them. In this gentle retelling, we linger on the quieter moments, a father tracing the outline of a party symbol with his finger, trying to interpret its meaning, a young woman carefully folding a pamphlet to save for later reading. A shopkeeper leaning against his counter and listening to a political speech played on a small radio. These moments made politics personal, human, and grounded. Security concerns and invisible anxiety. Of course, the insurgency cast a long shadow over preparations. Many Iraqis worried about safety on election day. Roadblocks increased. Coalition patrols became more visible. Neighborhood watches grew more alert. Community leaders urged calm and solidarity. Despite these concerns, people continued preparing. They bought groceries in advance so they wouldn't have to leave their homes unnecessarily. They planned routes to polling stations that avoided risky areas. They memorized the steps for marking their ballots. Even when anxiety hung heavily in the air, it coexisted with quiet determination. Election day, a soft turning point. When election day finally arrived, dawn broke slowly over cities and small villages. The winter air carried a chill, and many Iraqis woke before sunrise, whispering prayers or simple hopes for a safe day. Polling stations opened in schools, community centers, and administrative buildings. Security perimeters were established. Election workers set out ballot boxes, markers, and registration lists. To capture this moment in a calming, atmospheric way, imagine the soft shuffle of sandals and shoes on tiled floors, the nervous smiles of volunteers arranging voting booths, and the faint hum of morning conversations as people gathered outside the stations. Some voters walked in family groups. Others came alone, wrapped in long coats against the morning cold. Some arrived silently, while others chatted with neighbors in hushed tones. Inside the polling stations, the act of voting was almost meditative. People approached ballot boxes with measured steps. They marked their choices carefully, folded their ballots, and slipped them into the slot with a gentle, deliberate motion. Many voters left with ink-stained fingers, a symbol of participation. Some admired the mark. Others covered it protectively. In the privacy of their homes later that night, they would discuss their experience with pride, relief, or cautious optimism. Counting the votes. Once polling stations closed, election workers began the long, careful process of counting ballots. Boxes were sealed and transported under guard to central locations. The counting rooms were filled with stacks of papers, quiet but methodical conversations, and the deliberate rustling of ballot sheets being sorted. Observers from political parties and international organizations watched respectfully. Their presence meant to reassure citizens that the process was fair. The counting took days. Throughout the country, television stations ran continuous coverage, featuring analysts, commentators, and scholars. Radios repeated updates for households without electricity. In some neighborhoods, people gathered outside shops where televisions were placed near windows, sharing the slow sense of anticipation. The results, when they finally came, were mixed in terms of interpretation. No single party dominated. Coalitions had to be formed. Negotiations began. Disagreements surfaced. But the fact remained, the election had succeeded in its most essential purpose. Millions had voted. The act itself had reshaped Iraq. The meaning of the election. For many Iraqis, the election symbolized something deeper than political representation. It marked a rejection of the fear that had defined previous years. It signaled a willingness to imagine a different future, even if that future remained uncertain. Some older Iraqis wept when discussing the experience. Others spoke of feeling, for the first time in decades, that they mattered in the shaping of their country. Young adults, many of whom had only known dictatorship or conflict, felt an unexpected sense of empowerment. The election did not resolve Iraq's problems. But it created a collective memory, a moment when millions of people chose to participate in something larger than themselves. In a nation scarred by years of repression, this was profound. The road ahead, challenges and possibilities. After the election, Iraq entered a new phase filled with both hope and difficulty. Forming a stable government required compromise. Reconciliation between factions would take years. The insurgency was far from defeated. Daily life remained unpredictable. And yet, something intangible had shifted. The election served as a symbolic anchor. Whenever despair threatened to overwhelm communities, the memory of participation, of ink-stained fingers and long lines of voters, offered reassurance that the country had the capacity to move forward, however slowly. The transition to elected leadership was not a single step but part of a larger journey toward sovereignty, identity, and the rebuilding of national trust. As we close Part 19, Iraq stands in the aftermath of one of its most significant democratic moments. The next phase will involve the formation of a new constitutional government, deeper political negotiations, and the ever-present challenge of balancing security with freedom. Part 20. Long-term consequences and the unfinished story. As the dust of Iraq's first national elections began to settle, the country found itself standing at the threshold of a new era, not one defined by immediate resolution, but by the slow, complicated unfolding of a long-term transition. The election had brought a sense of accomplishment, even pride, to many Iraqis, but it also illuminated the work ahead. This final chapter gently explores the years that followed the initial political transformation, touching softly on what would shape Iraq's future, the ongoing insurgency, regional influences, constitutional development, and the gradual shift from occupation to autonomy. Our telling remains quiet and sleep-friendly. We meditate on the arc of history, on the lessons whispered by time, and on the resilience of a people navigating change. What we explore here is not the violence or chaos, but the deeper, structural movements that continued to shape Iraq long after the early years of the war faded from global headlines. A new government takes shape. Following the elections, the newly elected Transitional National Assembly convened to form a government that reflected the political realities of a deeply diverse nation. The assembly brought together representatives from across Iraq's varied communities. Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, Christian, Turkmen, secular, religious, tribal, and urban. The debates were intense but meaningful. Each representative carried with them the hopes, concerns, and memories of thousands of citizens. Some spoke for regions still suffering from power outages and water shortages. Others voiced the aspirations of newly energized political movements. Some advocated for strong federalism, others pressed for a unified central state. In this quiet retelling, we focus not on the friction, but on the significance. After decades of dictatorship, Iraqis were arguing openly about the direction of their country. These discussions unfolded in meeting halls filled with rows of simple chairs, stacks of documents, and murmured conversations. Delegates paused often to reflect, sip tea, and consider the weight of the decisions before them. Even the disagreements reflected something meaningful. They showed that Iraq's political space had widened enough to hold opposing visions, something impossible under the previous regime. Drafting the permanent constitution. One of the Assembly's most important responsibilities was drafting a permanent constitution. The process was delicate, requiring compromise on issues that touched the core of identity. The role of Islam, the rights of minorities, the structure of the federal system, the distribution of oil revenues, and the nature of civil liberties. Teams of drafters worked through long days and nights in sequestered rooms where fans hummed softly and the air smelled faintly of printer ink and strong tea. International advisors participated from time to time, offering comparative insights, though the heart of the drafting process remained Iraqi. The constitution emerged slowly, clause by clause. Some sections were resolved with ease. Others required hours of discussion. A few sparked passionate speeches, delivered not with rancor, but with the earnestness of people who cared deeply about their country's future. When the constitution was finally approved and put to a public referendum, it marked another milestone in Iraq's journey. Many Iraqis lined up patiently to cast their votes, their ink-stained fingers once again serving as symbols of participation. It did not solve all political tensions, indeed, some issues remained unresolved. But it provided a foundation, a framework upon which Iraq could build institutions, laws, and governance structures for years to come. The insurgency continues. Even as political progress unfolded, the insurgency persisted. Its presence shaped daily life, influenced political decisions, and complicated the path toward stability. Yet in the sleep-friendly tone of this narrative, we do not focus on the violence itself, but on the ways it influenced society. Neighborhoods became more insular. Local leaders took on greater roles in ensuring community safety. Schools adapted schedules to avoid risky times of day. Markets shifted the way they operated, with merchants becoming adept at reading subtle changes in the streets. In some towns, citizens formed neighborhood watch groups. In others, spiritual leaders reminded congregations to remain united in the face of fear. The persistence of conflict did not erase hope, instead, it reshaped it into something quieter and more resilient. The insurgency's endurance underscored the complexity of Iraq's transformation. Nation building, especially under conditions of insecurity, is never linear. But even amidst ongoing challenges, the commitment of Iraqis to continue rebuilding their society remained remarkable. Economic challenges and reconstruction. Reconstruction remained uneven. Some regions saw progress, new roads, reopened schools, improved electricity grids. Others lagged behind, hampered by insecurity or a lack of infrastructure. Unemployment remained a major concern, as did inflation and the slow pace of economic reform. Still, small milestones punctuated the daily rhythms of life: a shop reopening after months of closure, a generator repaired, a schoolyard filled with children again. Families celebrated weddings, births, and graduations. Farmers returned to their fields. tradespeople rebuilt their workshops. These modest victories offered comfort and continuity. International aid flowed into the country, but its distribution was complex. Bureaucracy slowed some projects, mismanagement affected others. Yet even imperfect progress was still progress, and communities found ways to adapt and persevere. Regional dynamics and external influence. Iraq's position in the Middle East meant that its internal politics inevitably attracted regional influence. Neighboring countries maintained deep interest in Iraq's trajectory. Politically, economically, and strategically, some nations formed diplomatic ties with the new government. Others supported different factions within Iraq. Still others monitored the situation cautiously from afar. In living rooms, Iraqis discussed these dynamics with quiet insight. They understood their country's importance and the challenges of navigating regional relationships. Many expressed the desire for sovereignty, for a future shaped primarily by Iraqis rather than external powers. These discussions, held under dim lamps in the warmth of family homes, revealed a population deeply aware of the complexities surrounding them. Coalition forces begin gradual withdrawal. Over time, coalition forces started to shift from a direct leadership role to a supporting one. Training Iraqi security forces became a central focus. More patrols were led by Iraqi units, with coalition soldiers in advisory positions. The sight of Iraqi police and soldiers taking the lead offered symbolic reassurance. It suggested that Iraq was moving toward self-reliance, even if the transition remained fragile. Gradual withdrawal did not mean immediate peace. But it signaled an important shift, the recognition that Iraq needed to determine its own path. Memory, healing, and the weight of experience. The early years of the Iraq War left deep marks on the country's collective memory. Families mourned losses. Communities adapted to new norms. The emotional landscape of Iraq was complex, layered with grief, pride, frustration, hope, and weariness. In this gentle retelling, we imagine evenings in Baghdad or Mosul or Basra where families gather on rooftops to escape the heat of their homes. The city lights flicker. Conversations drift between memories of the past and questions about the future. The air is warm, the night is still, and despite the hardships, a thread of resilience connects each household. Healing, in such moments, begins quietly. Not in formal declarations, but in the simple routines of life, sharing meals, telling stories, comforting one another, and looking toward tomorrow. The unfinished story. By the late 2000s, Iraq had a new government, a new constitution, and elected leaders. But the journey was far from complete. The years ahead would bring new challenges. Political disagreements, economic hurdles, social divisions, and the ongoing presence of extremist groups. Yet this unfinished quality is part of Iraq's story. Nations are not built in a single decade. They are shaped across generations, through setbacks, recoveries, and the enduring will of their people. As we close this final chapter, we recognize that the Iraq War's legacy is vast and multifaceted. It reshaped global politics, regional dynamics, and the lives of millions. But history also remembers the quieter truths, the resilience of communities, the courage of those who worked for stability, and the hope of individuals who believed in a better future. Iraq today is the product of that complex journey, still evolving, still striving, still carrying forward. And now, gently and quietly, our 20-part exploration of the Iraq War comes to a close. Thank you for resting with Background Historian. As we close this long, gentle journey through the Iraq War, we leave behind the documents, the dates, and the shifting political landscapes, and settle instead into the quiet understanding that history is always a human story at its core. It is carried forward by families, communities, and individuals who endure hardship, hope for better days, and continue shaping their world even when the path is uncertain. May this series have offered you not only clarity, but a sense of peaceful distance, a calm space to reflect and unwind. Until next time, may your night be deep and your rest be easy. Background Historian out.